Good evening. My name is Russ Porisky, and I'm the founder of Paradigm Education Group. What we're going to do tonight is what we call our Introduction to Your Human Rights educational course. What it is, it's a compression of our full course, the Canadian Illusion, which is about 12 and a half, 13 hours long. So you're probably going to come out at the end of this with a lot of questions because we just don't have time tonight. But what we're going to do, tonight's course is broken really into two halves. Before the break, we're really going to deal with who you are and what human rights are in relation to this country and how they apply and why it's important to know them, and give you some tools to see through what this thing that we call the Canadian Illusion. We had to give it a name, so that's basically what it was. And then we have a break, and then after that, we're actually going to take this information and start going inside some of the laws of this country. Now, Paradigm Education Group started years ago before it even had a name. And so to give you a little bit of background to where this all grew out of, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself, as I've lived out in Chilliwack since early 80s, and I've been in construction for all those years. And basically it was the early 90s, about 1993, I got something in the mail. It was mass mailed all across this country, and some of you might have even got it. It was years ago. And what it was sent out by the Michael Journal out of Quebec. And it looked sort of like a newspaper, and what it talked about was a lot of the legal foundation of this country. It talked about the banks in this country, it talked about income tax, and a whole, how that all fit together. That was my first exposure to this whole topic of our legal system and everything. Like, we all got lives, and we sort of look at stuff like that as something we never spend any time on. And I hope through tonight you'll be able to see that it is worthwhile spending some time on learning what's going on in this country, and especially who you are in this country, because that's where a lot of your freedom will come from. And so what happened out of that, I started reading that, and it really put a lot of the pieces together. Looking back, it was fundamentally flawed because this was a long journey by a lot of people across this country trying to put pieces together. It basically came to the conclusion that income tax was unconstitutional. And so I studied the stuff, and I saw it, and I adopted that position for a while. And because when you look at the pieces, it looks like that income tax was illegal or was unconstitutional. So as time went on, I had really got educated up to that point from that perspective. And because of the nature of my employment, I was self-employed. And anybody here who's self-employed knows is in relation to income tax, you get to write a lot of stuff off. So during the early years of my working there and stuff, I just studied the game of how to play the income tax game. And when you're self-employed, you get a lot more deductions and stuff like that. And so I got it to a point where basically, not only did I have my construction company, I had a side business, so I was a walking, talking tax deduction. I studied the game. But when I did that, then I started realizing what an unfair system. See, right next door to me lived some friends of ours, and they were both very highly educated. They did what they were told to do, what we're all told to do. You grow up, you get a good education, so you get a good job. Notice how they never finished that story for us, right? Well, add a few years onto your life once you've done everything they told you, and my neighbors were a perfect example of it. We both lived side by side. We both had the same amount of kids, and because of this whole thing, the income tax game and stuff, because I knew how to play it, I could support my family with just one income. Like, we were a little bit old-fashioned. We thought parents were supposed to raise their own kids and stuff like that. So, but they were forced, just economically forced, that they both had to go to work. And it finally got so bad that they couldn't really maintain a comfortable lifestyle. I mean, they were just putting in so many. So they packed up and they moved down to Texas. And we all heard that through the news years ago. That's called the brain drain, right? And the only reason they moved down there was because they had a lower tax bracket. So that was sort of not only seeing the inequity of that, and then learning the stuff that I started studying, primarily because of this article. I made a decision never to file again. And I thought I had a very justified position for that. Because I was self-employed, I could literally file and get my income on paper down to zero. And what that did, it triggered the benefits. All the child tax benefits and this and that. GST wasn't out at the time. But all those benefits, because they're all based on your income. And a lot of people still do that today when you know how to play the game. So I figured, well, considering the amount of work and the paperwork it takes to track everything you do all year long and then compile it and put it all down, I thought, well, it would make logical sense. If I quit filing, then they would save all this money on sending me benefits. Thought it was a fair deal, right? So I did that, and I figured they'd like that, and I was half expecting a thank you letter from them for being responsible and stuff like that. I realized something, it was nothing to do with the money. This whole game had nothing to do with money. It was all about control. So I got a letter, and it wasn't a thank you letter for saving the country money. Okay, it was basically a summons to go to court. During that process of getting to court, I actually got to a point where I could not, no matter how much they threatened me, I just could not file. I had seen too much at that point, and so we were willing to go to court, and I was willing to get the full maximum penalty. It's just, to me, it was just a wrong thing that was going on. So basically, what happened when we went to court the first time, my education had progressed to the point where I heard of this thing called a natural person. And it was a real fundamental. We're going to go through a lot of this tonight to show you where, almost the progress that I went through and the progression of the learning curve. I didn't really understand it, but it was real simple. A natural person was a human being, and this thing they called an artificial person wasn't. So I went to court, and I think I caught them off guard because they had known my background. They knew I was studying it from the unconstitutional perspective, and they probably thought I was going to come in there and argue the unconstitutional argument or something. So I walked in. When we went to court, I had like 3 different folders with 3 different defenses, because that time in the history of this country, there was groups all over this country trying to figure out what was going on. And that's why even tonight's course, we're going to focus on income tax, but I hope you don't leave here thinking all we talked about was income tax. Because when you take it outside the income tax field, you realize this whole topic of your human rights and how you fit into this country, this information you'll learn tonight will apply into all different aspects. But for tonight, because of the time stretch and stuff, we're going to just focus on income tax, because that was the start of my journey too. And so we went to court, and I had all these different arguments that I was going to progress. Because we live out in Chilliwack, which from the city's perspective, it's sort of an inconvenient to drive into all these meetings and stuff. So we never really plugged into any group or anything. We were just quietly trying to keep my own butt out of jail out there. But because of the internet, I was able to study. There was groups all across this country. And so studying, and especially from the unconstitutional perspective, and I realized that nobody had ever had any results arguing unconstitutional. I saw about 6 or 7 court cases go to the door of the Supreme Court, and they just said, no, we're not even going to hear it. So it left me with a decision. It's either, well, either our court system's corrupt, some will argue that, or maybe it is constitutional. And what that did, it started me looking at it a different way. Looking at it, how could they have made this thing legal? And so as we sat in court, I was talking to my wife, and I'm trying to figure out which argument to do best, right? And I had one file with all my court papers in it. And what was really unique about that is, because I had all my papers together at one point, I started noticing something. My name was spelled different on all the papers. And I knew at that point, I heard something called a nom de guerre, which talked about capitalization, your name and stuff like that. So I was saying, well, wonder what this is about. So I asked my wife, should I even bother arguing about the capitalization of my name? She never answered me, and I never answered myself, which was like a blessing in disguise. They called my name, I stood up, and the first thing out of my mouth, I said, excuse me, Your Honor, could you be so kind and ask the Crown who they intended to summons here, the natural person or the artificial? And wow, what a reaction. That Crown flew out of his chair, waving my court papers. Your Honor, he's trying to challenge the whole system, specifically the legal system. I'm going, what? I'm just asking a question. Well, to this day, they've never answered that question. But because they never answered it, what happened in the court case, the judge made some orders. One, he made an order that I was a natural person. Whether it existed or not, he made an order. Another, he made an order that I was the defendant. I was the person they were trying to charge. So that whole court case progressed all the way up to a couple more hearings and stuff. And we finally went and set a court date, and it was 11 months into the future, which was really nice. So we studied. It's like, well, if we're going to court, we better start studying this stuff. And we went to used bookstores, got law dictionaries. We went on the internet, went into statutes, and started really, really studying this stuff. One book we found was called Construction of Statutes, which, from my perspective, I lived 20 years in construction. I understand the need to have principles of construction, or how do you know if something's going to be built or stay up. And to find that in statutes, it showed me how statutes were built. So I used the same building philosophy and going in there, and started seeing a clearer picture there. So by the time we got to court, we were a little bit more prepared. I had about a 3-hour defense, and I thought it was very well structured. And looking back, I found it was fundamentally flawed. We still hadn't found the last piece. And so the court date starts. We walk into court in Chilliwack, and the Crown comes up to me and says, hey, look, we're really busy here today. They just accidentally overbooked the day. And I said, okay, you know, we're looking for our name up on the docket in the courtroom, and they usually have them up there, and ours wasn't up there. Courtroom 1 wasn't up there. And then the last minute, they go and put the docket up for courtroom 1. And on there was not only my trial, which was scheduled for basically the whole day, 5 other trials and about 15 first appearances. And it's like, wow, did they ever overbook the day? So we walked in there, and the courtroom filled up. It held about 35 people maybe, and it filled up. And it was sort of a different little atmosphere going on in there. And so the first thing we heard is the clerk of the court goes, oh, let's deal with this Porisky matter first. So I stood up and I said, hey, I don't even know if I'm still supposed to be here or not. Nobody's going to answer my question. Who do you guys want? I mean, I was still arguing that point. And they said, well, look, you know, we're not here to discuss that. We're just so busy. We overbooked the room. Would you mind going to Abbotsford? And I thought, well, you know, I even think today is like, what would they have done if I said, yeah, I would mind? I never, you know, if people knew how naive we were at that point, and it's really, that's what I hope by showing you some of this stuff is you don't have to truly understand the whole legalese of it. You just have to understand the component of who you really are. Because we didn't understand 1/10 of what you're going to see tonight. So we stood there and she said, well, you know, we're overbooked here. We just so happen to have a spare courtroom and a spare judge waiting for you in Abbotsford. Would you like to go? I said, well, I don't know if I got enough gas in my truck to get there. And so the judge looks at the Crown and says, well, would you give him $20 for gas? He goes, oh, yeah. Oh, okay. And then, okay, let me think something else. I don't think my truck will make it. You know, in construction, your truck gets beat up, so they look pretty bad. I don't think my truck will make it. So she looks at the Crown. She goes, hey, will you lease him a vehicle? And she goes, yeah. Oh, okay. I said, well, can I get 2? Because I got a lot of friends here. Right? So I said, no, don't worry. I got enough gas. My truck will make it and stuff. We'll meet you down there. What we didn't really notice, because again, when you're in those situations, you're blinded to reality around you. We got up, we left the courtroom, and so did everybody in the courtroom get up and leave the courtroom. Because it was just all our friends that came to see it. What was the reason they sent us to Abbotsford in the first place? They were overbooked. Well, where was everybody else that was supposed to be there at 9:30? And so as we look back, our brother-in-law, he showed up about 20 minutes late, walked in the courtroom, it was empty. You know, he goes, oh, well, where's the Porisky case? Oh, they went to Abbotsford. Everybody knew where we went. A business associate of mine, he walked in maybe half hour later with a partner, and it was still empty. So we went, wow, something's really going on here. So we drove down to Abbotsford, and we walked into this other courtroom. It was really different. It had not all that ornate woodwork or bars or whatever. It was just an open room with the judge's bench at the end and a bunch of chairs. Walk in there, the clerk says, oh, come sit up here. You know, you didn't have to do all the formality. It was a whole different atmosphere there. And another thing we noticed when we drove up to the courthouse, we noticed we were studying this law of flags and stuff like that, and we looked up, and yes, they had a nice little Canadian flag over the courtroom, you know, just attached to a little 2-inch pole. So we said, okay, it has a flag there, good. So we walked in, and then the court case starts going, and usually in a court case, the Crown gets up and they lay out their whole defense. And I was charged with Section 238, failing to comply to a demand letter. So it was real fundamentally simple. Did they send you the demand letter, and did you comply? Well, they sent me one, and they had proof. I didn't comply, so they had proof of that, so they thought. And so it's really fundamentally a simple court case. Like it's a no-brainer to win or lose if you haven't fulfilled it. So they got up and they laid out their case, and they had affidavits for this and affidavits for that. And that took us all the way up almost to lunch hour. And so the judge looks at me, and she goes, well, do you have any evidence and stuff? And I went, I knew by the study we have done is to realize there's a lot of stuff going on out there that we have no idea what words mean anymore. So I said, hey, I don't even know what that word means. So he says, well, it's close enough to lunch. Let's take a break and go see duty counsel, go ask somebody or whatever. So we had lunch. We're going out in the hallway there, and all my friends said, oh, man, it looks pretty bad. CCR had a really good case. And I said, well, thanks for your support. You know, you're going down. Yeah, but it looked really bad. So we had lunch and stuff, and we walked back in there. And I was getting prepared to present my defense. And I mean, I thought I had it nailed down really good. So I'm getting all fidgety and nervous and stuff, trying to get ready to do it. And the judge walks in. She sits down, and she looks to the Crown. She goes, where does it say in the Income Tax Act you can tell him where he has to send the files? And I go, what do you mean? We always tell him where we want them to send it. Well, it doesn't say that in the income tax that you can tell him where he has to send it. And they're going, what? And I started watching that the judge was starting to really spin this thing out of control, and the Crown's going, what? So the Crown would go for a huddle, and they call it a stand down, I call it a huddle, and they talk a little bit and come back and they throw in their interpretation of it. Judge gets a little perplexed, and as judge gets down, she says, well, I need to stand down. Judge gets down, goes into the back room, 5 to 10 minutes, comes back, and starts spinning another question. And this went back and forth probably 2 or 3 times. Finally to the point where the judge says, no, I don't see you guys presented your case. Not enough evidence here, whatever, case acquitted. And I didn't even have to say a word. I mean, I'm sitting there going, should I speak? No, she's doing good. I mean, she was taken over and did a really great job, so why should I open my mouth? And so that was it. We stood there, the judge says, case acquitted. And we knew that they could appeal it in 30 days, so we knew we weren't out of the woods. We waited the 30 days, no appeal. And we were going, wow, what happened here? My wife and I stood on the courthouse going, what happened? You see, as much of the study we've done, we still at that point didn't find this little piece, the importance of what had happened there. And that's what, even by the time we get to the break, we're going to take you to the simplicity of what happened in court that day. So as that progressed, stories like that, they sort of start drifting around, and we started getting emails and phone calls from people that wanted us to come and tell us what we did in court. It's like, well, we don't really know what we did yet. But what that did, we started meeting a lot of the people who were trying to find out the same thing, trying to figure out what was going on, what was this illusion we had going on in our country. And so over the next period of time, we started putting the pieces together and finding out what was really going on. And that started, basically, it just started getting busier and busier and busier. And after the first year, it was literally destroying my wife and my life. The phone was just constant. At that point, we looked at, because there was a lot of other people out there with the same passion, the same desire, and the same intent, we said, well, why don't we come together and form a group, Paradigm Education Group, to go out there and teach people their human rights so they can see through this illusion themselves. And that's really what brought us here today, is where Paradigm Education Group grew out of. It grew out of a couple scared people being forced into a situation that they really knew they had to stand up for something, regardless of the cost. So that brought us to where Paradigm is, and as Paradigm started growing and stuff, we started realizing that there was a lot of people out there across this country in a lot of pain who've been beat up big time by the system. Okay, I don't know if anybody's ever been audited or had this or had that, but it can get pretty brutal. But we realized is we could go out and tell these people, well, this is all you have to do, this is all you have to do, but that was not enough, because all it did was save them for that day. It didn't really educate them, and didn't really help them long term. So that sort of developed our mission statement: tell a man he's free, you free him for a day. Teach a man his rights, you free him for a lifetime. And that really became the foundation of Paradigm, to go out there and say, we will help anybody who wants to spend the time to get themselves educated, because we know it's not going to do anybody any good if we just did things for people. So as this progressed and stuff, really we started being able to boil this stuff down to get it smaller and smaller and more concise and stuff, and that allowed us, that's why we never had a condensed version of our full course for a year or so later, because it took so long. That's what tonight's course is going to be about. It's your human rights and the illusion. We're going to talk about your human rights, and then we're going to talk about this thing we call the illusion. Okay? I guess the illusion is that feeling. How many people here have a feeling there's just something wrong in this country? Okay, I think that's usually what draws people into rooms like this, is like, we know something's wrong, we just can't find it ourselves. Well, really what we found, what is this illusion? The illusion is nothing more than a modern, legalized version of past master-servant relationships that plagued mankind on and off for centuries. It's nothing new is what you're going to see tonight, and by understanding that, you realize the answer is nothing new either. We just got to go back to the point before this illusion was developed. It was created to deceive us all into believing that we as natural persons living in this real world are now just legal persons living in their legal world. It's a duality that's out there. Here's how we sort of look at it, and it sort of makes sense when you look at it. Before we had a country, basically, say we're all just running around, we didn't have a country, didn't give it a name, but we realized there was a lot of advantages coming together in the real world and working together, living in a society, creating a society. But we realized when we did that, there were still some people that never respected the human rights of others and would steal or hurt somebody, or breach a contract. So they put in a few layers of laws, good layers of laws, like the criminal code. Okay? The criminal code's great. Somebody breaks a law, you pick up the phone, and boom, you got society helping you. You're not out there alone. And then how about the non-criminal things, just like breach of contracts, right, which is our civil law system, not civil law like in Quebec, but our small claims court and stuff like that for contract disputes. So we had some good layers of laws built in and stuff into what this real world is. And then over time, as societies grew and the intricacies of our relationships grew and stuff, they realized the real world basically dealt with law as common law. you know, common sense, common law, basically the essence of God's laws, do unto others you want them to do unto you. So it came there for if somebody stepped outside of that balance. But they realized what common law really was just man's interpretations of God's laws, and, you know, in the history, the interpretation was slightly off, so they had to bring in some other layers like equity law and make statutes. Like in common law, there's no such thing as fraud. So that's why we had to have the statute of fraud is one of our oldest statutes. Because in common law, everybody's 100% personally responsible. You could have said no. So again, we started realizing, you know, there was some inequity out there under the common law, so they created some layers of statute laws, good ones, like the Partnership Act and the Mortgage Act and some really good statute laws. But then over time, they started adding these other layers. And these are the layers we're going to look at. Basically, we call them benefit layers. Okay? We'll give a few names of some of them. There's many of them, and you need to look at it. They put CPP, EI, income taxes out of CPP, say WCB, and all these benefit layers that they keep adding on. This is what we call these benefit layers, is what we're really going to focus on tonight, to show you how they actually relate to you. Because we believe this is what's causing a lot of that frustration and stress. Without understanding the multidimensional aspect of our legal system, we think when someone says obey the law, what does your mind do? You clump all laws onto one level. But when you actually look at it, if someone says obey the law, you can say, which law? Does it even apply to me? And so that's where we see the tension coming in, because we as natural persons, real persons, we think we're living in a real world, but what's happening as more and more of these statutes get created and benefit programs get created, and we think they're mandatory, it draws us into them. And that's what's putting that pressure. But I don't want that. I don't want to be. Where did you get the right to make me do this and do that? Right? Our whole goal here is, even as short as tonight is to give you enough information that you can see this yourself. And what we hope that'll do, it'll start putting this all into perspective and putting this back in balance by knowing who you are in this real world and how you relate to the legal world. Okay? You'll be able to start looking at these for what they are and then picking and choosing. Because there's nothing wrong with them if you want them. But that's what causes that frustration if you think you're being forced into something. Now we need to look at, and we don't spend a lot of time in here, who created this whole illusion and why they did it. It's really immaterial in the big picture. You can call them whatever you want, but in reality they're nothing more than a few self-proclaimed elitists who devised the scheme to economically enslave the citizens of this country. The reason it's immaterial is because if you would spend some time to learn who you are, they will dissolve. They only have their powers because we forgot who we were. So here's this, basically the background or the essence of this illusion. This one quote here, it's out of the private memoirs of Colonel Edward Mantle House with Woodward Wilson. And I like it because it's to the point. It's a few paragraphs long, but it just lays it out to the point. Now, up until about 3, 4, maybe a month ago, I always put it up here as unsubstantiated because I never could find the source. And we were doing a seminar, and a guy comes up and says, oh, no, I know where that came from. Because a lot of people across this country are finding it. So I used to keep it in there as unsubstantiated because I figured it expressed what we're trying to explain in a very few, to show you the illusion in a very few paragraphs, but also as a way that if you weren't ready to see things for what they are, like to say the illusion's treating you very well, you got a great life. You know, I sort of used it as here's your excuse to disregard everything else you're going to learn because we didn't have a substantiated one. I usually put a warning and that, hey, if you do have a comfortable illusion, you may want to leave. Because there's a reality is, once, you know, it's a quote basically, once the mind's expanded, it will never return to the same size. What we're going to go through tonight is indisputable, verifiable facts that you can pick up and see yourself. And it's going to maybe be disturbing, but maybe be empowering too. So it depends where you're at in life and how attached to the system you are, I guess. He goes on to say in there, he goes, very soon every American will be required to register their biological property in a national system designed to keep track of the people, and that will operate under the ancient system of pledging. By such methodology, we can compel people to submit to our agenda, which will affect our security as chargeback for a fiat paper currency. Every American will be forced to register or suffer being able to work and earn a living. Starting to sound familiar? They will be our chattels, our property, and we will hold security interest over them forever by operation of law merchant under the scheme of secured transactions. Americans, by unknowingly or unwillingly delivering the bills of lading to us, will be rendered bankrupt and insolvent, secured by their pledges. They will be stripped of their rights and given a commercial value designed to make us a profit, and they'll be none the wiser, for not one man in a million could ever figure out our plans. And if by accident one or two should figure it out, we have in our arsenal plausible deniability. We're going to show you how this is being applied even today. After all, this is the only logical way to fund governments, by floating liens and debts to the registrants in the forms of benefits and privileges. This will inevitably reap us huge profits beyond our wildest expectations and leave every American a contributor to this fraud, which we will call social insurance. Without realizing it, every American will unknowingly be our servant, however begrudgingly, and the people will become helpless and without any hope of their redemption, and will employ the high office of our dummy corporation to foment this plot against America. That's short, sweet, to the point, and it's very brutal. Who would even contemplate that there would be something going on? Okay? And again, I liked it when it was unsubstantiated, because it gave a person to say, well, I don't want to believe it. Good, don't. So I added in some substantiated quotes. This one's from Woodrow Wilson out of his book entitled The New Freedom in 1913. He goes, "Since I entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacturing are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it." And that's a president of a country. You know, again, we're starting to see it more and more on the news, because they're becoming more brazen. They talk about it, those secret governments, the one world orders and stuff. Where did this cycle, what we're living in is a cycle. Now we're in a new cycle, and where this cycle started, it was really back with a bunch of brothers, I think it was 5 of them, called the Rothschild brothers. And they understood how money could be used to economically enslave a person without them really knowing it. He goes on to say in here, one of the brothers, he goes, "The few who understand the system will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class." These are all the people who have a vested interest in enslaving everybody. But they go on to go, "The great body of people, mentally incapable of comprehending the tremendous advantages to them, will bear its burden without complaint." So unless you fall into this category, I'm assuming they're calling all us mentally incapable to understand what they're doing. So I took offense to that, and hope you do. So again, this illusion that we're talking about, it really boils down to the shackles, the main thread. You know, we go through this room, and I guarantee there's got to be 20, 30, 40 different occupations. We all come from different backgrounds, different everything. But the one thing we have in common, the common thread, is income tax. And that's why we really picked it as the example, as the topic, to actually show you the illusion. Because when you can see through that illusion, because how are we taught? What is income tax? It's as certain as death, right? The only thing certain as death is taxes, right? But when we can see through it, and you can see, wow, we've been lied to on that, you'd start looking and using it in other areas. So in Canada and worldwide, this illusion was created out of greed and can only affect us if we forgot who we are and believe it to be the truth. And as broad and interwoven as the solution is with reality, the main thread of the deception is income tax, and this common shackle that affects us all. So it's the best place also for us to start our search for our freedom, because if you can take control of that part of your life, the other ones don't even seem as bad. It's really simple. You know, again, we've reverse engineered this whole thing from where we were in court and the amount of information we had, trying to reverse engineer it down to a few words. Actually, I was challenged by a CFO of a company. We were in a meeting with their big accountants and stuff, and the guy's real prompt. He goes, "Give it to me in 25 words or less." It's like, yeah, right. We got like tons of information. But I took him up on the challenge, and I got it down to 5 words or less. I was really happy. Here they are, to really release these shackles from yourself in relation to income tax. 5 words or less. Quit working for the taxpayer. When your education gets to the point where you truly understand what those 5 words actually just said, you will be free the rest of your life, because you'll never fall back into the same trap again. The 2 words, see, all you got to do is quit working. You don't have to worry about taxes either. So how did these shackles get forged in Canada? Where did it really, like, again, we looked at some American documents, but when we really start getting deep into this, we realize, although the United States has a common law foundation, they threw in other layers. So Canada really is fundamentally different. And as you progress in your study, you'll actually, be very thankful you live in Canada, because we have literally probably one of the purest systems there. We're already free. We just don't know it. We get caught up into this thing. So how did these income tax start here in Canada? It's all started in 1913, when Canada passed the Bank Act and surrendered its power to print and issue currency to a few self-proclaimed elitists, the private bankers. The international bankers now controlled the federal government and the monetary system, and since then have created laws like the Income Tax Act to economically enslave people of this country. And it's with this economic control that methodically encroached upon provincial jurisdiction, using the World Wars, the Great Depression, or any other national concern they could justify to gain greater control. This thing didn't happen overnight. You know, Canada never even had a tax system until 1917. Okay, but this quote from William Lionel Mackenzie, a Prime Minister of Canada, it really says it all. It takes this whole illusion and shows you what the real problem of it is. Until the control of the issuance of currency and credits restored to the government and recognized its most conspicuous and sacred responsibility, all talks of sovereignty of Parliament and of democracy is idle and futile. Once a nation parts with the control of its credit, it matters not who makes the laws. Usury, once in control, will wreck the nation. And that's what we're experiencing. That's why when you watch the news, the education system is collapsing, health system is collapsing, everything's collapsing. It's not collapsing because you're not paying enough taxes. It's collapsing because it was designed to collapse. Because someone came in many years ago and took over our monetary system. So how did income tax start? After they signed the Bank Act in 1913, it took 4 years for them to create and attach an income tax act to the people. You see, because of the fundamental foundation of our country, they couldn't just say, hey, people, you're going to have to pay income tax. They had to actually bring it in, and they had to bring it in under certain conditions. So first thing they did, they created World War I and passed the War Measures Act. You know, we look at that and say, what, they created it? Yes. These bankers, they finance both sides, and they pick and tell who's going to win. Okay? And then that allowed our government, our federal government, to pass the War Measures Act, which, because there was a national emergency, a concern, certain times, under certain acts like this, our federal government is allowed to leave its jurisdiction, to go and make laws it's normally not allowed to make. And one of them was entering the field of direct taxation. From there, the next year, they passed the Special War Revenue Act in 1915. Okay, they go to the people, you know, hey, the war, we got to do our patriotic duty, we got to pay taxes and stuff, we need a little bit. So they brought it in there. Next year, they said we need a little bit more money. They want to pass the Business Profit War Tax Act in 1916. Went to the people and said, we need more money, you know, we like our freedom, we need to pay for it, but we're only going to tax the businesses. So nobody really cared. Then they finally passed the War Income Tax Act in 1917. And that was the first time in Canada's history we had income tax. And yet today we think it's been around forever. But look at what they had to do just to get to that point. And even at that point it was unconstitutional, but they had the authority to do it under the War Measures Act, as it was a direct tax which was the exclusive jurisdiction of the provinces, but was considered a necessity because of the World Wars. And because it didn't affect the average person much like it does today, few people were even concerned or even bothered to question the legality. See, when you really look at this whole game in the big time frame, this had nothing to do with money. They didn't care if they made a penny off of it. They just needed to get an income tax act into Parliament, into the legislation. Okay? Back then, I think for the average individual, it was 3% on the first $10,000, or 110,000, which is the equivalent to like $300,000 today. We wouldn't be sitting in this room if income tax was 3% on the first $300,000 you made, would we? We would even tolerate that. Okay? That was not the intent. It was the illusion they brought it in. They triggered our patriotic duty. So once they had it in, and the bankers had control, now they could start moving it forward. In 1929, they created the Great Depression. It was set up. People knew what was going to happen in August before the Great Depression hit. I think it was in October or later that year. Okay? What they did, we were able to show the governments who actually controlled the monetary systems now. So with control of the stock markets, they caused hardships for many people. Now, with economic control and the ability to manipulate the economies, they cause booms and busts, creating hardships at will. See, they'd be able to create these cycles of good times, bad times, good times, bad times. And when you're in the bad time, guess what you'll line up for? Benefits. In 1940, they created the UIC card, which is really an indirect tax disguised as a benefit. That's how they had to actually bring it in. They disguised it as a benefit to get people to sign up for the card. And really at that point, it really had no grander detrimental illusion, because all it was, what they were trying to do with that, it was the start of their personalized tracking system and the attachment of the federal government giving them jurisdiction over those who applied. See, our federal government was not created with jurisdiction over our private lives. So it needed a way, it had no ability, no reason, a way to track us and stuff. Then in 1950 and through that period of time, they were infringing on provincial jurisdiction all over the place. And finally, in 1950, their control was challenged in the Lord Nelson case, which resulted in a Supreme Court order giving the federal government 12 years to remove themselves from the exclusive provincial jurisdictions, get this country back the way it was designed. Okay, and it was during these 12 years, from 1950 to 1962, they developed the illusion that we have today. What we're living in today, we never always lived in it. Okay, today they have a controlled federal government, which created corporations with the same names as the provinces, which gave the federal government control over these companies they just created. And with their illusionary country built, they can now pass laws that appear to invade real provincial jurisdiction, but do not. This allowed the federal government, which was controlled by the world bankers, to create a top-down power structure with a de facto federal government and enter into stuff like the provincial tax collection agreements by 1962. This is exactly what the Supreme Court told them they couldn't do, is enter into agreements with each other. So when you look at this from an unconstitutional point, it's evidence like this, you go in and it says it's unconstitutional, until you get to the point where you actually see how they did it. So they created agreements like that with their federally created companies without violating the 1950 Supreme Court order or the B&A Act, the created document of this country. And the only thing they had to do now is to keep the people blind to their illusion by using the media to promote fear and create fictitious courts to punish anyone who refused to obey them. So that's a high-speed spin through history to give you a little bit of background of where this income tax came. It wasn't just there. So from 1962, here's what income tax is now. The illusion was built, and they just needed a few more laws to enslave the people en masse. In 1964, they introduced the Canada Pension Plan. It wasn't attached to anything. It's just, they offered it to the people, a retirement pension plan, if they'd use their social insurance number to work. Well, who wouldn't? They actually mass-mailed social insurance cards all across this country. It was like, you use this to work and you'll have a retirement pension. And it was a really good pension. From what we've been able to study there, it was for every dollar you put in, you could get like $700 return. Great investment. It's not that way now. Some people are lucky to get what they even put in back out. Okay, but that's how they had it started. Okay, so people couldn't see anything beyond what it was. Then in 1967, they attached the Social Insurance number to the Income Tax Act, which by now was a modern version of the original War Income Tax Act, except for the fact that it was now constitutional, as the tax had turned into an indirect tax for created artificial persons and no longer applied to natural persons with inalienable human rights. And that happened all within that 12-year period. It was because of the supremacy of our human rights and the federal government's limited jurisdiction that they could only attach the Income Tax Act to an artificial person, as it was a legal entity, a legal person without human rights. And that's where it started to become important of understanding what your human rights are, because you'll be able to see certain laws can't even attach to you. You have to actually volunteer. And so over the years, we've been able to boil this down to what I call the simple reality. That's the brochure you have there. Income tax is nothing more than an internal federal excise tax, which is only mandatory for those who choose to work as a legal representative under an implied contract of service for the benefit of a federally created legal artificial person known as a taxpayer. And the same illusion is literally the same everywhere where human rights are recognized. This quote from Ronald Reagan, who just passed away. I like the guy because he was saying some good stuff, especially as he was getting up there in years. He goes, someone asked him about the taxpayer. He goes, oh, the taxpayer? That's someone who works for the federal government but doesn't have to take the civil service examination. And that's really what it is. And we're going to, as we get through, our whole goal is to be able to go inside that Income Tax Act so you can see that yourself. And by going that far in and you seeing it yourself, that's truly where your empowerment comes from. Okay? So start looking at this illusion, seeing through the illusion. I like looking at this children's story. Anybody here read that children's story, The Emperor's New Clothes? The essence of that, right? There was a couple rogue tailors who trying to scam the king there, and he goes, yes, we got this beautiful, beautiful yarn, fabric, but only people of true heart or righteous or whatever can actually see it. Well, the king didn't want to look like a fool, so, oh, yes, it's beautiful, it's beautiful. Well, that story spread around the kingdom that only people of pure of heart could actually see this fabric. So the tailors, they built this, or sewn together this beautiful garment and stuff, and everybody who came to see it in progress went, wow, that's really pretty, that's really nice, because nobody wanted to see, to feel bad about things. Until one day when the king was doing a parade through town, and everybody's going, ooh, ah, they saw what they were told to see, because they wanted to fit into society. And you start seeing the parallels of that story. Until one day a child standing on the side of the road says, hey, the king is naked. He saw things for what they were. See, he did not have a vested interest in the illusion that was created. There's a lot of wisdom in that story if you spend some time reading it. So, and I put this in here not to try to get you to see something that's not there, because I know how we've all been trained. We've been taught to see things that they want us to see, and you'll see that as we progress through. So simply use your God-given ability of innocent perception. We all have it. We all had it as kids. You know how when you take your kids out, you hope they don't say something? Okay, that's reality. So all we're asking is to see things for what they are, and you'll see what's there. So as we move on, before we even get into that, and this is why the first part, we've got to give you some tools to actually see through the illusion. And we need to start asking ourselves some questions like, who are you? When someone asks you that question, who are you, what do you answer? Do you answer with your possessions? Oh, I'm the owner of that big apartment there, or that house, or this. You know, are we attached to our possessions? Is that who we become? Are you your social status? Oh, I'm this, or I'm that. You know, I'm not one of those people. Are you your occupation? You know, friends of ours, the ones I was talking about, they were telling us about parties they'd go back east, you know, when they were younger, and people would introduce themselves with their occupation. Again, this stuff isn't bad if it's in balance, right? Or are you your education? I mean, that's what's pounded into us in society. You go out there and get a good education. So now do we judge each other by how many letters we got behind our name? You know, you got letters behind your name, but you don't leave home without them. You know, it becomes who you are. Again, they're not bad, but if you can't release them or see them for what they really are, what they've turned into and what they become is their false identities created in our minds because we forgot who we are. Because you don't know how to describe yourself anything different, so you're almost forced to pick one of the other ones. And they prevent us from seeing things with our innocent perception. If you're not willing to release them, they'll keep you from knowing the real you. Because you won't be able to look beyond that illusion that was created. So have you ever questioned yourself, too, about what you know? You know, what you know and why you know what you think you know? Have you ever stopped and looked at all the stuff that you've learned and why you know it and you know, what you think you know? Like, we look at stuff like the Income Tax Act. What do you know about the Income Tax Act? Why are you paying taxes? You know, so where that comes is this, years ago, really just before the First World War, they started doing stuff, trying to figure out how we as humans worked and how we thought, individually and in collective. And what they found was that 87% of us create their beliefs based on the opinions of others, while only 13% use deductive reasoning. Now, we all have the ability to use deductive reasoning, but because we've been brought up, we'll just accept the opinions of others. Like, really ask yourself, okay, why do you pay income tax? And when you really get to the bottom of that, you know, have you sat down there and you've read this whole act and you truly understand it? What if it said in the first 3 pages or the first line that you didn't have to? Wouldn't you feel like sort of sad right about now? So that's the thing, is a lot of us are paying income tax. I know why I first started. I never even, you know, I used to do a lot of commercial diving. I was out in the ocean and I was young. I didn't even worry about the game like this until I started getting into construction, and my partner was 20 years my senior. You know, and after the first year of construction, he goes, son, we're going to have to file our income tax. I went, oh, okay. I just listened to somebody else. And so we can be aware of this is what they know about us. Then that may motivate us to say, oh, let's hold it. If this is how we may, and I don't think we do this out of because we're incompetent or anything. I think we do it because we're just trusting human beings. You know, we were raised to trust our government. That's sort of getting a little heavy right now. But so don't look at it as anything bad, but look at this other part about using deductive reasoning. We'll show you that. So we got to look at that, and you can take that concept into all your belief circles and ask yourself, what created your belief circles? I mean, like I said, this goes way beyond taxes. Say here's a cross-section of all of us. Inside each of us is the real person, who we really are. But what we have wrapped around us is all our belief circles, and we need to look at where they come from. You know, we look at like taxes, rights, politics, money, religion, status. It's really funny here when you look at it. What are the 3 things we were taught to never talk about at Christmas or Thanksgiving or mixed gatherings, or especially in front of the public, right? Taxes, politics, and religion. What a great thing to teach people from birth, so that we never sit down and start looking at things together, keep us separate. Well, we're not going to go into all these tonight. We're probably going to go into that belief circle and look at, you know, have you examine your belief circle around taxes. But I just wanted to show that, and we looked at these belief circles, how are they held together? Are they held together because you've actually gone and studied certain facts yourself, or were they just the opinions of others that you took on? And were the opinions created through deception? We're going to look at how deception, what we think we see, is not what we're actually seeing. How about culture? Some of your belief circles are probably brought through with culture. And again, belief circles aren't bad or anything like that if they don't hurt anybody else. How about apathy, though? Apathy is one thing that now is really, when you start looking at how this system is decayed and beat people up. How many people know somebody who's about 40, 45 that they just gave up? It's just too much hassle trying to beat the system off, right? They're 40, they're just waiting to die. Apathy is something that is really going. But a lot of your belief circles, believe it or not, are built and encased in fear, because they know how powerful that fear is. And look at how many people here would be very willing to have CCRA phone them tomorrow. How many in fear of CCRA, right? How many people here are too afraid to admit that, that they're afraid of them? See, fear and deception are the two thickest layers. Fear is a reality. You know, for the first year and a half, we had like thousands of facts, and we could spin this stuff deep as you want to go, and we realized it was, people still weren't seeing it. Because what weren't they seeing? Weren't they seeing the facts? But we realized they couldn't see through the fear. So the fear is a reality, and we don't diminish it or anything, but I think it's important to look at yourself and say how much of your beliefs are held together by fear, or your actions are restricted by fear. And again, belief circles, we all need them, and they're all part of us, but they're not bad. You need to look at them, though. Do they create separation? Because that's what they've tried to do, is keep us all separate. Tell us never to talk about these things in a group, right? Keep your own, you know. That's why they go after people separately, so we make it a big shame. What if we all stood up and said, let's get this game over and call it for what it is? So again, as you start exploring those, as time goes on, you may come to some, you know, recreate your belief circles, because they're constantly, how many people here have the same beliefs they had when they were a kid? So they're constantly changing. Okay, so be willing to allow that to happen. What we're going to look at here, though, today is you, the real you, who, regardless of your belief circles, we're at the point that we're all the same. The real you, you're a human being with inalienable rights and freedoms. Bottom line, the truth becomes very simple to express. You have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and property. And they're all basically, you can't have one without the other. When you contemplate the oneness of this, it's a very, you start realizing you can't have life with, and be a human being without the liberty and the property, or have property without the freedom and the life to enjoy it. So they're all, you cannot disconnect these. I like looking at these, though, from the other perspective, okay, because they're just, you can spend the rest of your life contemplating these yourself. But if we look at it from the other, say we're the elite, and we had a meeting, and we were saying, okay, we know these people out there all have human rights, but we want to enslave them. How are we going to do it? Well, let's look at what they have. They have the right to life. Should we acknowledge their right to life? Well, logically, sure. What good's a dead slave, right? Okay, so I mean, we can do, how about liberty? Should we let our slaves be free? You know, give them the freedom to move around? Absolutely. What good's a slave strapped against the wall? And I'll think about it, too. If we let our slaves move around, we can charge them for everything that they do. You know, the amount of money we can make as they move around. And by the way, too, what's the best type of slave to have? One that thinks he's free, right? He'll work harder. Okay? So we look at a little bit of property. Okay? What is your absolute right to property? What is that property? I like looking at it real simple. You know, because we know our labor is our property. If you have an absolute right to your property, how does that affect in this big picture here? So if you look at property, it's funny because sometimes we separate property based on its value. But what's the difference between, say, this pen or a pair of shoes or $1 million house? If you own it, you own it, you own it, and all the laws of property still apply to it. So I like using the parallel between shoes and our cars, you know, something in mid-range there. And you look at it as how many people here have ever been given a ticket for not wearing a seatbelt? How many? Okay, how many people here have ever been given a ticket for not having their shoelaces done up? Yeah, one, yeah, right. Country's not that bad yet. But what's the logic behind it? How are we sold on one, and why don't we question it? Where'd they get the right to force you to wear a seatbelt in your own car? Yet they can't force you to tie your shoes up. Well, the logic is if you're not wearing your seatbelt, you get in an accident, you're going to cost the system a lot of money, and so it's for the betterment. Same thing applies to shoelaces. If you step on your shoelace, you crack your head on the thing, we got to pick you up with an ambulance, take you to the hospital, years of rehabilitation. So I think we should need a law for shoelaces, right? Same logic if it applies. So what did they do? How did they get that authority to give you, to infringe on your rights in relation to your car? If this is your car, it's totally yours. And as long as you don't use it to violate anybody else's rights or cause imminent threat of damage, what harm have you done? Well, when you understand that your absolute right to property, regardless what's in there, how many people here have done this to their car? Registered it? What did you do when you do that? How many people here have registered their shoes? And when you start looking at property, forget the value, look at it for what it is, it's all the same. When you register your car, and I don't know the the legal semantics of it, but let's say what you've done though is you split the title. Let's just say you gave them a legal title, just a higher title, and you retained equity title. And you did this voluntarily because you were going to get a benefit. Yeah, I know you don't see the benefit in there, but technically there's always a benefit in there. So we register, we get a benefit we may not even know about. What that done is you've given them a higher title to your vehicle, telling you that if you want this benefit, this is how you have to drive the car. And that's how many things have you registered? That's how they split title, giving them authority over our property. A friend of mine had a boat. Actually, he's an educator up north. He had a boat for many years. And just before he came to take the educator's course, he got some papers and thing, you know, suggesting he might want to register his boat. So he filled them out, sent them off, came, took the course, and went, oh man, goes home and gets a bill for 25 bucks. First time in so many years he's ever had to pay anything for his boat. Because once he split that title, they could now start charging him for him, bit by bit by bit. So again, when we look at that, we need to look at this in relation if this is your labor that's inside this property circle, because your labor is your property. Your thoughts are your own property. So when we start looking at that, keep that in mind as we progress to get more in depth onto the income tax system. But here's the one right, your free will. To truly understand those inalienable rights we just talked about, you need to respect and understand the power of your own free will. It's a lack of awareness of free will that has allowed the illusion to prosper to the point it is today. Free will is what has produced the life that you have now, and it's with greater awareness that you can create the life that you really want. This is about the most powerful thing about you, and they know it. And the last thing they want you to is really understand who you really are and the right of free will that you have. Because if you look at your life, have you ever noticed that everything that has caused you grief and frustration, you actually had to apply for it first? Think about it. How many people applied for a social insurance card, driver's license, this, that? If these things were all mandatory, why'd you have to apply for them? Why'd they need your signature? Because they know who you are and they know the limits they have, and they need you to voluntarily enslave yourself. So that's what we hope by looking at who you are and the rights that you have, we can actually go in and you can start, again, putting your life back in balance. You'll start seeing some of these benefit programs aren't bad, but are they what you really want? Okay, so it can't be overstated, the power of one's own free will. So when we looked at that, it's just like I'm up here saying, this is who you are, these are the rights that you have. Well, does the system acknowledge that or recognize that? Sure, if we go through our system, nothing's changed. The only thing that's changed is we forgot who we really were. Here's a historical recognition of the real you. This comes from Blackstone Commentaries. He was a Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas in England around the middle of the 18th century. It was about 500 years after the signing of the Magna Carta, which is probably one of the first, quote, quote, human rights documents. Okay? And what he noticed in England about 500 years later, guess what? That people were forgetting who they were and the rights that they had. So he took it upon himself to write these Blackstone Commentaries, and they're just to try to re-educate the people of England of who they really were. We go into there, in book 1, I believe it is, he goes, he named the 3 absolute rights as being the right of personal liberty, the right of personal security, and the right to property. He goes on to talk more about your right to property. He goes, the 3rd absolute right inherent in every Englishman is that of property, which consists of the free use, the enjoyment, and disposal of all his acquisitions, all his property, without control or diminution, taken away, taxation. Saved only by the laws of the land, and the laws of England are therefore, in point of honor and justice, extremely watchful in ascertaining and protecting this right. And upon this principle, the Great Charter of Magna Carta, Section 39 declares it, because this was 500 years after this was signed. Section 39 of the Magna Carta goes, no free man shall be arrested or imprisoned or deceased, have his property taken or outlawed, taken outside the protection of the common law, or exiled or in any way victimized. Neither will we attack him or send anyone to attack him except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. What's the law of the land? Must be proven before a jury of peers that one did damage or imminent threat of damage to person or property. Wouldn't that be nice if this still was in existence today? You were free and they couldn't touch your property or tax you or this, until you caused damage to somebody else? Section 40 of it is one line, but it's very, very powerful when we understand what it's really saying. It goes, to none will we sell, to none deny or delay right or justice. Because these are your rights, and that's why no one can sell them to you. Here's the federal recognition of you, 1960, out of the Canadian Bill of Rights. Preamble is really all you ever need to know to remain free in this country, if you really understand it. Actually, the second paragraph. But I'm going to read the preamble. What it is, okay, it's the Parliament of Canada affirming that the Canadian nation is founded upon principles that acknowledge the supremacy of God, the dignity and worth of the human person, and the position of the family in a society of free men and free institutions. Affirming also that men and institutions remain free only when freedom is founded upon the respect for moral and spiritual values and the rule of law. It's the balancing factor. See, freedom isn't free because you've got to respect other people's rights that they have. You've got to find that balance. And so be desirous of enshrining these principles and the human rights and fundamental freedoms derived from them in a Bill of Rights which shall reflect the respect of Parliament for its constitutional authority and which shall ensure the protection of these rights and freedoms in Canada. So the federal government recognizes it. Section 1 on there just goes on to expand. It goes, it is hereby recognized and declared that in Canada there have existed. See, that was 1960. Where did our rights have existed long before this? We don't even need it technically. And shall continue to exist without discrimination by reason of race, national origin, color, religion, or sex, the following human rights and fundamental freedoms, namely the right of the individual to life, liberty, security of person, and enjoyment of property, and the right not be deprived except by due process of law. Isn't that what Section 39 of the Magna Carta just said? Except for in here they go to the enjoyment of property. So some people say, well, we're not allowed to have property anymore, but just we're allowed to enjoy it. How do you enjoy it if you don't have it? The reason they had to put enjoyment there is because our federal government has no jurisdiction over property, our property. So they couldn't even grant or deal with it, so they had to cover it up, put it something like the enjoyment of it in. Section 2 of the Canadian Bill of Rights. This is a 2-page statute law. This is literally, I think, is the most powerful legislation we have. It's not giving us anything. It's protecting us from the government. It is this 2-page statute law, which is the whole essence of what happened in my court case. Okay? Because it goes here, Section 2 says, every law of Canada shall, unless it's expressly declared by an act of Parliament of Canada that it shall operate notwithstanding, in spite of the Canadian Bill of Rights, be so construed and applied as not to abrogate, abridge, infringe, or to authorize the abrogation, abridgment, or infringement of any of the rights and freedoms herein recognized and declared. What that said in English is, unless you go inside a statute like this one, and you find in here, in prescribed form, an express declaration saying this is allowed to infringe on your human rights, then you can legally and safely assume that that thing doesn't apply to you because it doesn't say it's allowed to infringe on it. Here's the provincial recognition of the real you. See, what we're looking at is your human rights are the fundamental reasons this whole country was built. They're held above all. This is out of the Sang Chong case of 1909, way long before the illusion that we live in today was built, basically when things were what they were. What this was basically, I think Sang Chong was a produce vendor. He'd load up his cart with produce in the morning, go out in the streets and just sell, make a living. Like we all do. We wake up, we go to work. Well, City of Vancouver at that point started bringing in bylaws and said, well, on this day, you're not allowed to be on the street till 10:30 in the morning. He woke up, he went out before 10:30. They tried to fine him or whatever. It ended up in court. Here's what Justice Irving said in relation to that bylaw. He goes, among the normal rights which are available to every British subject against all the world are personal safety and freedom, one's good name, the enjoyment of the advantages ordinarily open to all the inhabitants of the country, so no discrimination, like the unmolested pursuit of one's trade or occupation. How many people here are told, need licenses to do what they want to do? Okay? Is that not like restricting in it? So how does that fit in? It's not like having someone come in and forcing to give you half your money, sort of an infringement on your trade or occupation. And the free use of our highways. Okay, that's a whole nother topic. I mean, think of what it costs you just to get your car on the road, let alone even drive it. All the rules and regulations that you got to first accomplish before you even get there. Freedom from malicious vexation of the legal process and to one's own property. So you're starting to see the same simplicity of what human rights are all about. He goes on to say the same thing, and there he goes. Where restraint is sought to be put upon any person in respect of the exercise of any of those natural rights, I think it's the duty of the court to assume that the legislature did not intend to interfere with them, unless clear and unequivocal words have been used. Is that not what Section 2 of the Canadian Bill of Rights just said? Unless you read it in there that your rights will be infringed upon, the courts will even assume that the thing didn't even apply to you. We look at the universal recognition of the real you, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This came out in 1948, after the Second World War, when we realized it's probably time we started growing up as human beings. We started seeing what we could actually do to each other. and started realizing that that would result in no benefit for no one. Okay? The atrocities that happened during all that time. So out of the UN grew the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And it's really a great article to understand because your human rights are so inexhaustible list, it's really hard to even to think about them. So when you can find documents that actually helps your mind understand them, it's a little easier. It goes, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. We've got to get to that point where we start realizing that we are all equal. So Article 1 states that. It goes, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. This here is probably the most powerful thing to even understand. If we're all born free and equal in dignity and rights, and somebody says that you're supposed to do something, don't you think you have the right to ask them where'd they get that authority? See, and that's when we realize we're all just the same, no one has natural authority or divine authority over you. And they are endowed with reason and conscience, should act towards one another in the spirit of brotherhood. Okay, that balancing factor again. Article 3, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of persons. Article 4, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. So if this thing actually applied to you as a human being, would that not be a form of slavery? What do you call it when you send someone to work? Actually, what is today? Today is Tax Freedom Day. There, now you're actually working for yourself tomorrow, right? On average in Canada, I think BC is actually into July 3rd or something like that. Article 17, everyone has the right to own property alone as in well in association with others, and no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. So I hope you're starting to see, wherever you look at any level of government, any level of bureaucracy, you're starting to see the same thing. Your human rights are recognized and protected. And that really creates this essence of this legal maxim. I like a legal maxim because what it is, it's an absolute truth in law. And they're really based on a lot of logic, reason, and understanding. This one here, actus legis nimium facit injuriam. An act of law does injury to no man. I know that's hard to believe when you've been spending the last 20 years under the Income Tax Act. Translation, an act of law is to be so limited in its operation that none of your rights shall be prejudiced. We look at this and go, that means that none of these statute laws and these laws that they pass can actually hurt us? And it's hard to believe, but when we look at the reason behind this, let's think about it. When we as individuals came together and formed a society, you think we would create a government, like we came together, created the government because you need a government, and give that government enough power to hurt us? Of course not. So that's the logic and the thinking behind this. So when we start looking at all these human rights, and it starts adding that frustration, is like, because the real question we need to be asking, if we have all these rights and freedoms, then why do we feel like we're slaves? Right? If what we just said had any validity, then why? What's happening that we feel so enslaved that whatever they tell us we have to do? To answer that, we have to start asking other questions like, what kind of person are you? And I don't mean like, oh, I'm a real nice person, I walk my neighbor's dog a couple times a week. No, legally. See, that's the real world. In the legal world, what kind of person are you? This legal maxim, I don't even like reading that one, so it's really hard. I'm not even trying. Every person is a man, but not every man is a person. Say that again. Every person is a man, but not every man is a person. Man or woman, so you can interject that, right? That's sort of like a little brain twister, but when we actually can step back and see it in an example, it wasn't too long in our history before where women weren't allowed to vote. Why? Weren't they human beings? Of course they were. But they were not recognized as a person in law. So we're starting to see what's called a duality of person. Blackstone Commentaries again, book 1, page 123, goes, persons are divided by law into either natural persons or artificial. And this is about all I knew when I stood in court the first time from the perspective of this information. I had a lot of history stuff, and he goes on to explain that. He goes, natural persons are such as God of nature formed us. Artificial are such as created and devised by human laws for the purpose of society and government, which are called corporations and body politics. So I need to point something out here for later. This is back in the 1800s, late 1700s. They used the word corporation. That was way long before we had incorporated companies. So basically, artificial persons, another word for them is corporation. So don't get that confused with incorporated companies. That makes sense later. So I saw that, but again, that was from the 18th century. And I'm thinking, does that still apply in Canada today? So I went to a corner store, actually over in the mall, and got Canadian Law Dictionary. Opened it up, flipped through, and said, does this natural person still exist? Natural person is a human being that has the capacity for rights and duties. Artificial person, a legal entity, not a human being. recognized as a person in law to whom legal rights and duties may attach. So here's today's first pop quiz. How many people here are a natural person? See, to me, that's how simple it was. But I remember the first time I ever seen the word natural person, it was like, what is that? We actually did a little article that got printed up on somewhere in Banff in a little newspaper, and the guy at the newspaper says, yeah, some people think a natural person was someone naked running through the woods. You know, so it's like, it was a really weird concept to actually see it. So what's this artificial person? It's it's a figment of man's imagination. It's two-dimensional. So we had a hard time explaining to people, or people to visualize what these artificial people look like, so we made one. And that's basically a two-dimensional illusion, created in the mind of man that you can actually represent. So that's where we're at when we start looking at the duality of person, and we take that inside this legal system, some things start making a little bit more sense. I started looking, well, does this natural person exist in statute law? So I went through tons of them and stuff, and I found it all over the place. Not in every one, but generally in quite a lot of them. Out of the Excise Tax Act, the GST Act, it goes individual, means a natural person. Is that pretty clear or what? Okay, no issue there. And then they say when we use the word person, it means the individual, which means the natural person. So we know when we're in there somehow. We're going to look at that later. How are we in there? Then I went to the Bank Act. I haven't counted in person. One of the educators said there's like 56 times they have the word natural person in the Bank Act. So this thing started to become more of a reality into my life, whether I understood it or not. They go there, person means a natural person, an entity, or a personal representative. Pretty clear, right? So we know we're there. I read on in the Act a little bit, came to 15.1, and look what it said the bank was. It goes, a bank has the capacity of a natural person. Now some people looked and says, oh, banks are natural persons. No, they're not. They have the capacity, which means they're over 18 and they're mentally competent. I know we could argue that second one there for a bit, but nonetheless. Okay? And subject to this Act, the rights, powers, and privileges of a natural person. So this is what we need to think about. Maybe why have they held this from us? Why isn't this taught in our schools so we know who we are? Have you ever gone traveling around and go to big cities? What are the biggest buildings in all those cities? And who owns them? The banks? Yet are they more powerful than you? If we start looking at it from this perspective, the bank has the capacity, they're over 18 and they're technically mentally competent, but they're subject to this Act. Are you? No. So who has more rights, powers, and privileges, you or a bank? See, maybe that's why they didn't want us to know who we really were in this legal system. Because their power only comes from us being naive or ignorant of our rights from within it. And this came to that point, it's like when I saw this duality, and we knew it had something to do with capitalization, is after our first, we were very fortunate. Our first appearance, how'd that go? First appearance, we actually went in there, and we were very fortunate. It was just before Christmas. And so I started talking about this capitalization, who do you want, this, that, and everything, and the judge says, look, we're really backed up. They had about 100 things to do that day, and it's getting near Christmas, so everybody's pushing. He goes, let's just set this over, come back again. Well, because it was near Christmas, we actually had about a month break between our first appearances, eh? So we went over to the bookstore. I mean, I grabbed law dictionaries, and I sat there, and because I knew it had something to do with capitalization, I started looking up capitalization. Because what do we think when we say the word capitalize? Well, just to put a big letter on something. But let's look at it in its adjective sense, to take advantage of. Used to one's own advantage. So when you look at that, I say, if you capitalized on something, whose advantage would it be for? Yours. If they capitalized on something, whose advantage would it be for? Theirs. So you start understanding the aspects of it. As I was going through there, I came across this, this concept called capitis diminutio. And for some reason, I knew what it said when I saw it, primarily because my paperwork all reflected the same layers of it. Okay, capitis is Latin for head. You're heading, you're captain. Diminutio means to diminish, to take away. Okay, so it's a Roman law concept, not common law. It's a diminishing or abridgment of a personality, a loss or curtailment of a man's status or aggregate of legal attributes and qualifications. And this here is what we saw on my court paper, some different forms of capitalization. And we never understood what they meant until we actually got a little bit further study on it. But let's start off with this point here. What did I just write on the board here? Did I write a name? I just write words? What are they? From our rules of English construction, these are just two words. What, slang for an outhouse and a female deer. But what if you like the sound of those? John Doe. Say them. John Doe. Hey, I like those. So what are you going to do to them? You're going to capitalize on them. And voila, now what is it? It's your name. And that's how our names are. We just capitalize on words we sound. And this is us as a natural person in this legal system. It's a right that we have. Have you ever watched like Crime Stoppers or something where they're looking for Dave Smith, Bob Jones, a.k.a. AK-20 list? He never gets arrested for that because it's a natural right. You can change your name every day as long as you don't do what? Use it for criminal purposes to hurt other people, right? So I looked at that, and some of my paperwork had this form of capitalization on it. And what that was capitis diminutio minima, the lowest or least comprehensive degree of loss of status. So we lost some status, but how did it relate to that? And this occurred where a man's family relations alone were changed. It happened upon the pride of a person who had been his own master. You see, before you plug into this legal system, guess what? You're a sovereign individual. You under no man's laws, you're a country unto your own. So you got to make a decision. Do you like this country or not? Or do you want to leave? So at a point, you're your own master. So what you've done is you say, no, I want to plug into a system. I'll give up some of my rights. And what you're doing is you're plugging yourself under a social contract. Canada has a beautiful, pure social contract. It infringes on our rights so minutely, but it also gives us the protection of the system. So it's a fair exchange, okay, of his own right, not under any legal disability, or upon the emancipation of one who'd been under patria potesta, parental authority, one who's been freed from parental authority. It's talking about our children. Who gives your children their names? You do until they're old enough and they don't like the name you gave them, they'll pick their own. But it's a right we all have. And the nice thing about that, within that, it left the rights of liberty and our citizenship unaltered. Okay, so if you're getting the protection of your rights in a country like the Canadian Bill of Rights, would you want to leave this country? Or would you want that protection? You want that citizenship. Okay, so that's how we saw the first one, when my name was spelt in traditional upper and lower case. Then I had some other papers which reflected the second one, capitis diminutio media. Have any of you ever seen your name written like, was just the last name capitalized? I had papers like that, and I'm going, well, it looked like a typo. We never really even give it any thought. What that is, though, when we look at it within this structure here, capitis diminutio media. Capitalization diminish your rights to the medium. A lesser or medium loss of status. This occurs where a man loses his rights of citizenship, but without losing his liberty. It carried away with it also his family rights. So you got to look at that. You're still free, but you have no legal system to protect you. And if all your rights and freedoms are recognized and protected under the Canadian Bill of Rights, would you want to leave your country? But when you voluntarily accept this, and this is how my summons was, you basically left your country. And I had my summons, and I held it up to the judge, and I said, Your Honor, if I accept this, will you protect my rights? First he goes, no, and then he went on to explain, but the whole audience went, whoa. Because what that would have done is effectively had you voluntarily leave your country, lose the protection of the Canadian Bill of Rights. And this is the simple fact that I addressed it, saying, you know, I want you to change it then. He said, it doesn't matter, because I brought it to his attention, it became an irregularity. So that was, my summons was like that. Then I had these other papers called capitis diminutio maxima. Now we look at this. Have you ever seen your name written like that? Full capitalized. If you haven't, flip open your wallet, your purse, start reading it. Where this falls under is the highest or most comprehensive loss of status. This occurred where a man's condition was changed from one of freedom to one of bondage, when he became a slave. And it swept away with it all rights of citizenship and all family rights. So you're just basically a slave. So we've got to look at these three structures, and this is my lay of information. I'm sure we've all seen a lot of stuff. Is this us as a natural person? Could this be us as a natural person? We'll look at this one. Could this be us as a natural person? Technically, yes and no. We'll say yes, but what it really is a human being without a legal system. So if the legal system acknowledges natural person, then yeah, it is. We've only seen this one, this capitis diminutio media, in a couple cases. One on diplomatic ID. Who can break a law in this country and not be punished? Diplomats. Two, on a children's registration. That's a tricky one. And we have to think about why would they do that? Well, because Canada is part of the UN. And one of the ideas of the UN is all those human rights are supposed to be taught profusely within a society. How many people here have learned about their human rights in school? See, if you get outlawed when you go to school, and that's what we're doing, we're outlawing our children, we're sending them outside the legal system, where you're outlawing them to is not part of the UN, so that requirement's not there. Just by the stroke of a pen, by not seeing things for what they are. And this other one here, could this be us? Well, if this was us, that means we were just enslaved. And that in and of itself would be a violation of the UN, it would be a violation of the Crimes Against Humanity Act, violation of so many other laws This could not be us. But if you created an artificial person who had no human rights, would this be violating anything if you enslaved them? So we look at this as the artificial person, and this is a human being without a legal system, and this is a natural person recognized and protected in the legal system. So the thing is how do we connect these artificial people? Okay? How do they make that joinder to that? And that's really where the word is. The only word we can find that fits into this is the word joinder. But before I go to that, I want to sort of touch on this. Now, what you just laid out here was a very structural format, but you'll never always see it used that way. See, they knew, as they created this, the odds of getting every bureaucrat at every level behind every desk adhering to that would be very slim to none. Okay? So they made a rule that allowed them to break this rule. And it's Section 38 of the Federal Interpretation Act, talking about common names. And you'll find the same clause in every Provincial Interpretation Act. It goes, the name commonly applied to any country, body, place, body, corporation, society, officer, functionary, person, party, or thing means the country, place, body, corporation, society, officer, functionary, person, party, or thing to which the name is commonly applied, although the name is not in its formal or extended designation. So if this is the formal name of this entity, it doesn't matter if they go J.Doe in upper and lower case or do it reverse. It doesn't matter until it gets to the point that it actually becomes a contract. Okay, and we'll show that a little bit later. So what you'll find is don't look for a strict adherence to it. What you need to do is, if you're in question of whether they're talking to an artificial person or the natural person, is you got to find the source of creation. Which jurisdiction, which legislation are they speaking to you through? Okay. So again, this course here, the other course goes a little bit more deep to analyze that here. But how do they create this connection between us as natural persons and these artificial persons? It's this word we call joinder. It's the joining or coupling together, uniting two or more constituents or elements into one. Uniting one person in some legal step or proceeding, a union or occurrence. So there's a way that we can become a representative joined to these artificial persons. How must it occur, though? Voluntary, unconstrained by interference, unimpelled by another's influence, spontaneous and acting for oneself, proceeding from the free and unrestricted will of the person. See, they're very aware of your free will, and they're very aware they cannot force you to represent these guys. So they need you to get to believe that you have to do it. See, when I stood there in court that day, even though I have a social insurance number, even though there are times I like representing the taxpayer, that moment in court, I did not want to represent him. And so they had to make, because I wasn't representing him, they had no choice. They couldn't trap me back into it. That's the power of your free will, is when you know who you are, you know also who you're not. Now, why must it be voluntary? We looked at this already. No one should be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. And to force you to represent these artificial persons is a form of slavery, servitude. So how can it occur, though? And this is usually how it occurs. This is probably the number one way most of us have been attached to these artificial persons without human rights. It's tacit. It's existing, inferred, or understood without being openly expressed or stated, implied by silence. If you don't say no, you just said yes. So when someone says, are you the tax, or, what's a good example? Well, the judge, he held up my lay of information. He'd go, are you Russell Anthony Porisky? I said, I don't know. I can't see what you're reading. You see, I'm not going to say yes or no to that question until I know who you're really talking about. Because once you understand there's a duality and someone says something that sounds like your name, maybe he's asking for this guy. Let's see what you're talking about. So the lay of information had that. I said, no, that's not me. Change it to this, and I'll be here. So this is called tacit acceptance. It's a civil law concept. Again, it's repugnant to common law. A tacit acceptance of an inheritance takes place when some act is done by the person which necessarily supposes his intention to accept, and which he would have no right to do but in his capacity as that person. And that's your capacity as a natural person having the right to contract and enter into these agreements, whether you know it or not. So it's understanding the duality of person and this multidimensional illusion that they've created of law, of who you are and what you have to say yes to and what you don't have to. So why was there a need for this illusion? All we looked at, this whole thing of capitalization and all this creation of artificial persons and stuff. Why did they need it? Well, in a society where there is no illusion, you don't need to create all this stuff. But when you understand that there are other people who are trying to basically enslave us on it, the answer to that question will lie within the creation of this country. Okay? It's under the British North American Act, the We're told now it's the Constitution Act, but that's what it started as, the B&A Act of 18. Without this, Canada did not exist. It's a statute law from Britain which allowed for the formation of Canada. It's the Act for the Union of Canada, which is Upper and Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the government thereof, and for purposes connected therewith. Okay, it's a statute of Great Britain. It goes, whereas the provinces of Canada, which was Quebec and Ontario at the time, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, have expressed the desire to be federally united into one dominion under the Crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. See, we're told, and they hold this up, hey people, here's your constitution. It's even named that. No, this is not our constitution. This is the B&A Act. This is a rule book for how our government's supposed to be structured and what they're supposed to obey. Our constitution is similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom, which is what? The Magna Carta, Act of Settlement, Bills of Rights. See, the United Kingdom's constitution actually took about 500 years to develop. And because some of the documents, like the Magna Carta, from today's standard, it's sexist, it's racist, it's a whole 9 yards, it could not be brought in word for word. But the principles of what they were trying to express were there, that we're all free, we're all equal, and we have these rights. So that's what they brought in. Okay, they brought in the principles of the Magna Carta, not the words of the Magna Carta, the essence of it. And whereas such a union would be conducive to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. And this is where we go back to that 1950 Supreme Court ruling. To me, it's one of the best history lessons you'll ever have. It'll really show you what this country really is and its true structure. And it'll start answering these questions about why they created this illusion. It was 7 Supreme Court judges basically laid this out. Okay, the system of government best adapted under existing circumstances to protect the diversified interests of the several provinces and to ensure efficiency, harmony, and permanency of the working of the Union is a general government charged with matters of common interest to the whole country, which is what? Our federal government. Okay? And local governments for each of the Canadas, Ontario and Quebec, and for the province of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, charged with the control of local matters in the respective sections. So again, when we look at that from this perspective, we see the rationale, the reasoning behind it. Before we had Canada, the federal government, what we had were just 4 separate provinces. And when you look at it, look at this as if you're in your neighborhood. There's you and you got 3 other neighbors. And each household has to do all the duties for everything. And you say, hey, why don't we all get together and create this other company and then hire this other company to do all the things that are common to all of us. Like we'll get him to take the garbage out for all of us and stuff like that. So we started looking at that. When they created this country, they said, look, it makes sense. We only need 1 post office. We only need 1 currency. We only need 1 military. So you start to see the logic behind it. So they created this company and they gave it a list of duties. But what they did is they retained what they wanted to keep. So who had the power in the first place? Provinces. Okay, well, one of the things they surrendered to the federal government was the right to collect indirect taxes. But they retained direct taxes. And this here becomes the basic argument of people who think it's unconstitutional because they think, well, the government's collecting direct taxes. And what they did in exchange for this, they knew that indirect tax was a very big field of taxes. About 80% of taxation can come through indirect taxes. They said, we'll surrender that to you, and what we want you to do is you collect it, and then every 10 years at that time, but it's 5 years now, we'll have a census, and then what you do, you send back a fixed sum plus so much per head. And that's why we have a census. We call these transfer payments now. So that was the structure of when they brought that, when they created this company called Canada. We go on in that Lord Nelson case, because we're trying to figure out why did they create the illusion around here. It goes, the Constitution of Canada does not belong either to Parliament or to the legislature. It belongs to the country. And it is there the citizens of the country will find the protection to the rights to which they are entitled. Okay, so inside here it's the preamble where we know we're connected to Britain's Constitution. And they also go on to say, though, in there is that no power of delegation is expressed in either Section 91 or 92, nor indeed is there to be found the power of accepting delegation from one body to another. What they just said there is, once this thing was created, they put a wall between them. And they said, okay, all the things that you do, you have to do them, and all the things that we do, we have to do them. And we can't hire or enter in agreements back and forth. And now, all of a sudden, we have this provincial tax code. Think about when you file your income tax forms. How many do you file? 1 federal, 1 provincial. But where do you send them? Just to the federal. So if unless these Supreme Court judges are lying through their teeth, what's going on? Where did the federal government get the right to have us file and then do the tax collection agreement with them? It's It's either unconstitutional or whatever. So we're going to expand on that to look as this goes through here. And he goes, I have no doubt that if it had been the intentions to give such powers, it would have been expressed in clear and unequivocal languages. He goes, under the scheme of the British North America, there were to be, in the words of Lord Atkin of the Labour Convention, reference 1937, watertight compartments, which were an essential part of the original structure. So what you're seeing here is where a lot of the misunderstanding, the arguments come that it's unconstitutional because our federal government should not be collecting provincial taxes. Even if provinces were allowed to create an income tax, which they can't on us, but even if they were, they don't have the jurisdiction to collect them. Okay, so that's where a lot of this confusion is coming into. We go on to there, and we find it in there. The Parliament of Canada and the legislatures of the several provinces are sovereign within their sphere, as defined by the British North American Act. But none of them has the unlimited capacity of an individual. So who has more power in this country? You. So what you're seeing here is if you look at the true structure of this country, you have the people. It's a country that's founded on the supremacy of God with the people who created the provinces, who themselves said, let's create another subordinate thing and dump some stuff common to there. That's the way our country's true. But what do they want us to believe it is? What do we think it is? Who's in charge of our country? Federal government. We got the poor old provinces begging for transfer payments and hanging out. Oh yeah, and we're the people here somewhere, all right, going, what do you want me to do? It's the illusion they had to create because they know how this country was really structured and who we really are. But it's only an illusion. Okay, we have a great country. The foundation is set. I looked at this very much like building. We have a great country. There's, so part of our motivation on educating people was, there's some people trying to destroy this country. Is why destroy what is great? We just got to go in there and do a little bit of renovating. We already got one of the best foundations out there. So when we ask this, why the need for the illusion? The answer is simple. Because they know who you really are and they know the law of creation. The created cannot be greater than its creator. And who created them? We the people. And by keeping us naive and ignorant of who we are and the rights that we have, this becomes the result. They get this illusion of power. So how do we see this illusion? Everything that this system does, it will be written down. It's all within there. So how can we go inside and see it going on? To do that, we need to get inside that illusion and look at it for what it is. How many people here have ever read a statute law? Okay. How about the income tax? Right? How did we read those? Did we sit down and dissect them word for word, or we just read them? Okay? Now, when we look at these things, they're called principles of interpretation. Like I say, this was, for me, probably one of the best books I got to read was The Construction of Statutes, because I understood the principles of construction. And I found a section that talks about words. Okay, Lord Green said, the first thing one has to do, I venture to think, in construing words in a section of an Act of Parliament, is not to take those words in a vacuum, so to speak, and to attribute to them what is sometimes called their natural and ordinary meaning. Few words in the English language have a natural and ordinary meaning in the sense that they must be so read that their meaning is entirely independent of their context. You can't take a word and just leave it and everybody knows what it means. Very few words are like that. The method of construing statutes that I prefer is not to take particular words and attribute to them some sort of prima facie meaning, which you may have to displace or modify. It is so to read the statute as a whole and ask oneself the question, in this statute, in this context, relating to this subject matter, what is the true meaning of the word? Imagine trying to read a book that slow, analyze every word. Okay, but that's what's needed to be done when you're dealing in this legal world. Goes on to talk a little bit about definitions. Lord Simon says, he goes, nowadays we should add to the natural and ordinary meaning of the words in their context and according to their appropriate linguistic register, which is like legal dictionaries, definition sections, basically a hierarchy of definition where you can find the authoritative. On in there they talk about there are different reasons for having definitions. In some cases it's intended to subtract from or add to the normal meaning of a word. In some cases, it's intended that a word or expression should have a secondary rather than its primary meaning. It means something totally different from what we ever thought it meant. So let's look at all that and put it into example. What is the meaning of the word fair? Now, across here, again, we probably all had a bunch of different ideas. When we first looked, that's what they're saying. You can't just take a word and everybody understands it, because we need context around it. So let's add some context. He went to the fair for fun. Now we're all pretty well on the same page, right? Well, what if we missed a step? Let's check the definition section first. Fair means moon. How many guessed that? When you look at it and say, well, you can't do that. That's stupid. That's illogical. That's immoral. That's so this. What you're seeing here is the difference between the real world and the legal world. A lot of things that are illegal can be made, are unlawful, can be made legal when you go inside. Okay? This is nothing new. This here is about the simplicity of seeing through this illusion if we'd slow down and try to read these statutes for what they're really saying. We've tracked this back to 16th century there. Betham's theory of legal fiction. They called it word magic. It's taking a word and using through definitions, making it mean something totally different. So when I said, hey, I'm going to the fair tomorrow, right? I said, I'll give you $100 if you go to the fair. Who's going to win? Because when I tell you what the definition of fair was, you just lost. I can't get to the moon. This is what we're going to look at, is to actually, if you can accept this principle of how they played the game, you will see it and you'll start understanding this is a really scary game. Now, when I was starting this whole research, I got very confused. I remember sitting at my desk, I had dictionaries open, statute law open, I'm trying to figure out what does a word mean? Because it meant something different here, something different there, something different there. But over time, by persisting on that, I started seeing some structure, some arithmetic format to that. So a procedure sort of developed for the source of authority for the definition of word needs to be followed if a reasonable interpretation of the intent department is to be established. So if you're looking at a word and you check the act that you're reading, you check in if it's in a subsection, you check to see if that one word had been redefined in the subsection you're looking at. If it hadn't, then you can feel safe. Then you got to go to the definition section of the act. Okay, because that one word could have been redefined for the whole act. If it wasn't, then you need to go to the Interpretation Act. Okay, what the Interpretation Act, every province has one and the federal government has one. They lay out some of the principles of interpretation, rules of construction, plus they also have a list of common expressions defined. They'll put a lot of words in an Interpretation Act which carry a default meaning over all their statutes, so they don't have to redefine it in every statute. So you've got to go and stop there to make sure that word hadn't been redefined in there. If it hadn't, then you should go over to a Canadian law dictionary. Now here was a bit of a dilemma. You know, which book would you think is more authoritative here? A big one or a little one? I mean, that's how I thought, right? The big one was enticing, but when I started realizing, hold it, we're in Canada. So it would make sense to stop at the Canadian Law Dictionary. Then if it wasn't in there, then you could go to something like Black's Law. Because see, Black's Law is American and English jurisprudence. Now that's our heritage, so yes, we're allowed to go there. But there's some words in here that have been redefined different than in here. So we need to stop at that point first. And then if the word we're looking at, we can't find it in any of this, then we could probably go to a good old Canadian English dictionary like Oxford's, Gage's, whatever, and it probably meant what you thought it meant. Now imagine trying to read a statute like that. But that's the process that had to go through, and it really, once you see it, it actually becomes faster and faster and faster. Now there was one word that I ran it through this process many times, I could not believe what I found. What is the meaning of the word includes? How do we use that word? Does this room include chairs? Yeah. We use it as an enlargement, as an add to. I guarantee you go through all, whether you're in the legal world or real world, you can't find the definition of how we use it in any of these dictionaries. Here's Webster's dictionary. Include, to confine, hold, contain, to comprise, to comprehend, to embrace or involve. Gage's, include, to put, to hold, to enclose within limits. So let's visualize what includes looks like. When something includes something, it is just enclosed it within limits. Okay? So let's jump into the legal world. Go to these law dictionaries. Black's Law, include, to confine within, to hold in an enclosure, take in, attain, shut in, contain, enclose, comprise, comprehend, embrace, involve. Is getting the picture? It just means very restrictive. So if I said this room includes chairs, I actually just said this room is a chair. Okay? But when you add the ing, including, may, according to the context, not always, express an enlargement and have the same meaning of or and in addition to, or merely specify a particular thing already included within the general words there to be used. So there's ways to enlarge it. You can go all and includes, also includes without limitation. See, that's almost how we should actually be saying it. This room includes without limitation chairs. And that would have just blown off the restrictive sense of the word. Okay? Now this was probably the hardest word. I don't know how many months I spent on it, because to me it was like, no, it can't be. You know, emotionally I couldn't accept what I was reading in front. So I kept digging and digging, came across a legal maxim. Inclusio unus e exclusio alteris. The inclusion of one is the exclusion of another. The certain designation of one person is the absolute exclusion of all others. So it started restricting. So let's take this legal maxim, which is above our emotions and our opinions, and apply that into the Canadian Interpretation Act, Federal Interpretation Act under the word person. This is the default meaning of person in federal statute unless it's redefined in the statute. Person, or any word or expression descriptive of a person, includes a corporation. Now, does it include anything else? Now, our mind just assumed corporation meant something like IBM or McDonald's, didn't it? But a corporation, in federal statute, when they use the word corporation, it means artificial persons. And we'll show you that as we go. When they need to use an incorporated company, they'll redefine it. In BC, whenever we see corporation in our provincial statute, it actually means an incorporated company. So you can't take one set of rules and apply them into different jurisdictions. There's slight differences. So we'll move forward to that. And again, my search kept looking, and finally this Canadian Styles, it's a government-printed manual from the Public Works, Chapter 12. They had words commonly misused or confused. Two words is like, what is the difference between include or comprise? For both of them are restrictive senses, what is the difference? Well, includes implies only part of a whole. Comprise implies all the parts. So water includes hydrogen, right? Water comprises hydrogen and oxygen. So you see the difference? We take that concept and look at it in the legal world. If it was up until today you never heard of the duality of person and law, and you only assumed there was only one person, how could you create a part of a whole? But when you start looking at the duality of it, it's really multidimensional. I haven't counted them all. Somebody said there's like 27 to 30 some odd different artificial persons. They're all different. They're all created for different specific reasons. So when we look at the word person in law, it comprises of natural persons and a whole bunch of artificial persons. So when a statute law says a person includes a taxpayer, does it include the driver? No. Does it include the owner? No. Does it include a natural person, a human being? No. It only includes part of the whole. And it's really easy to see, because ask yourself, when you got your social insurance card, how many people here got them before they were 16 or something, right? We all got a couple of test laps before we had to use them. Were you allowed to drive? No, because it didn't create the driver entity. You see, they create different entities and they use it. And that supports then the inclusion of one is the exclusion of the other. So we look at this word includes now with that concept of what we learned and now start applying it within statutes. Okay, the Assessment Act. This one we're not going to understand in the intro, but I left it in here. If you're curious, you'll understand it by going to the bigger course. He goes, land includes land covered by water. This is all we paid taxes on. Now, I know BC has a lot of rain, but I thought this was getting a little ridiculous. B and C were sand and gravel and quarries. So either you live on land covered by water, you live in a gravel pit, or you live on quarry. If you don't live in it, why are you paying taxes? Property taxes. When you understand the illusion of admiralty jurisdiction and water and stuff like that, that makes perfect sense. Now take a look. They already know what the word includes mean. Here's out of the Land Act, construction purposes. Includes without limitation. If includes had no limitations, why would they have to put that? See, they know it's a very limited and used word. Here's the land tax deferment. I like looking at this and say, let's throw out all these rules and principles of interpretation. Let's just read this like we read a bedtime story. Okay, just what a word means, okay? So let's take the natural and ordinary meaning of minister and we'll add the rest of that. Because that's how they tell you. Oh, when you look at a word in a statute, it's the natural and ordinary meaning. They'll use includes as plus that. Okay, fine. See, they can't have their cake and eat it too. So let's go in there and say, okay, what's the natural and ordinary meaning of minister? Well, there's minister at church, minister in parliament. So there's a few of them, right? Okay, so this act refers to a minister plus a person designated in writing by the minister. So if there are no rules or principles of interpretation, that means you can go to the minister at the church, have them designate you in writing to have authority under the Land Tax Deferment Act to go and write notes to all your friends so they could defer their land tax. You think that's how the intent of the statute was created? You see, when you understand, you have to follow the rules because without that, it could mean anything. Okay, so let's look at Canada Elections Act. Person includes an elector, voter, or candidate. So does that include us? Motor vehicle, I like this one. Accident includes an intentional collision. You go, well, that can't be. I had one last week and I didn't do it on purpose. If that's what you're thinking, you're missing the whole point here. This isn't all about us, it's about them. When you understand your human rights, if you cause damage or even threat of damage, guess what you have? Due process of law. Do you realize how expensive that is? If I can get you to sign up for a nice little driver's license, which is attached to the Motor Vehicle Act, which is basically the contract agreement you've agreed to, And in there, I can get you to confess that whenever you say the word accident, you just told me you did it on purpose. Now I'm dealing with just guilty parties, and when there's no need, I have confessions all over the place. That way, human rights is very costly for them. When we start looking at the game from their perspective, it starts making a lot of sense. Now, here's where I basically stopped my search. I mean, for some reason, we have some educators who say, I had no emotional attachment to the word include. Personally, I had a hard time accepting that includes was restrictive. So I kept searching, finally came across this BC government client service agreement. It's basically a tax-free structure contract. We call it a contract for hire, for clarity. In there, because this is a contract the government uses to interface with people in society, they wanted to watch the language. In there, they had an interpretation section for words used in the agreement. 16.2 says, in this agreement, the words including and includes are not intended to be limiting. So if they weren't limiting in the first place, why would they have had to put it in there? Because they know it's limiting, and because this contract was going to be read the way we normally read, they needed to release the boundaries off it, so in this agreement, it would mean the way we use it. So that was basically the end of my search on includes, and you'll see how important that word is as we progress into this. Okay, another word we need to look at, it's nowhere near as complex, is this word individual. What's the natural and ordinary meaning of individual? Person, she's a clever individual. So that's how we see it. A being, a thing, forming one of its kind, a single person, animal, thing. So this is the real world use of the word individual. When we go into the legal world, it really hasn't changed that much, but it starts focusing a little bit. It goes, here's out of Black's law. It's redefined in Canadian law, so this one sort of overrides it, but they're both relatively the same. It goes, individual, a private or natural person, as distinguished from a partnership, corporation, or association. But it is said that this restricted signification is not necessarily inherent in the word, and that it may, in proper cases, include artificial persons. So what they're saying is, for the most part, whenever you see individual in a statute, it means a natural person, but not always. We jump into Canadian Law Dictionary, and we basically see the same thing, but it gives us a better perspective on it. It goes, individual, a person under the Canadian Bill of Rights. The right of the individual extends to natural persons only. So that Canadian Bill of Rights we looked at, who did it apply for? Who did it protect? Natural persons only. Okay? That is, and when we don't even know we existed as that, what good is that statute? But when we know who we are, that statute's very powerful. And not to corporations. Okay? But it goes on to warn us again. The scope and meaning of individual has also been interpreted for other statutes. Bankruptcy Insolvency Act and the Income Tax Act. So we need, again, when we ever see the word, we can't just assume it's one thing or the other. We actually have to slow it down and check it out and try to support it. Here's a few more principles that you're going to need. Okay, whenever we see the word shall or may in statute, the expression shall is to be construed as an imperative, and the expression may as permissive. Okay, shall is must, may you can if you want. 15.1, 15.2 of the Canadian Interpretation Act. I'm going to touch on these. They're not going to make much sense until you see them actually in play, but I want to plant the seed so you'll see them when they come. So definitions or rules of interpretation and enactment apply to all provisions of the enactment, including the provisions that contain those definitions or rules of interpretation. So what they just said here is when you look in a statute and you see a bunch of words redefined in the act itself, like fair means moon and stuff, what they're saying is if in here you find this word, you don't run out here to the natural and ordinary meaning. You take this definition and drop it back in. So the words roll in on themselves. Again, once you see it in play, it makes a lot of sense, okay? But 15.2, he goes, where an enactment contains an interpretation section or provision, it must be read and construed as being applicable only if a contrary intention doesn't appear. You'll see how that plays in. Sometimes a word, if you actually try to take this meaning and drop it in, it would actually collapse the statute. It just wouldn't make sense. So there's times we can see that. But B is more important to remember, section 15.2b, as being applicable to all other enactments relating to the same subject matter unless a contrary intention appears. So after the break, we're going to be looking at the Income Tax Act and at the Excise Tax Act. What's the subject matter of both these acts? Taxes. So what they just said is all the words that are defined in the Income Tax Act by law carry their meaning into the Excise Tax Act. Okay, unless it's redefined, this word, say here, is redefined over here, then this doesn't carry over and it carries this meaning. And then vice versa. All the meanings in this act by law mean the same thing in this act. It doesn't happen that often, but this here is an important thing. Again, when we see it in play, it'll make a little bit more sense. Now here's about the most important thing that you need to, if you forget everything about all this principles of interpretation, rules of construction, just remember this one point. It is this single point was the whole reason of what happened in my court case. Why I didn't have to say a word. Okay? When I went into court and I kept beaking there and I said, but Your Honor, you know, I said, I don't even know if I'm supposed to be here. She goes, well, there's an order here that you're a natural person. There's an order here that you're a defendant. And I didn't really hear her say that, so I kept beaking again, and she goes, you know, I thought she said shut up or something, but she said, don't worry, sit down. Why would a judge at the beginning of a trial tell someone not to worry and just sit down? What did she know I didn't know? And we go through this permissible presumption, it really becomes so simple, it's hard to even accept. It's a very important permissible presumption that is perhaps the most frequently invoked, or at least has the greatest range of applicability, is the presumption against interference with vested rights, your natural rights. Using the statute that declares the intention of Parliament is the Canadian Bill of Rights. Parliament has itself declared in effect that in the absence to the contrary by Parliament, in a prescribed form, an intention to infringe on human rights and fundamental freedoms must not be attributed to Parliament in any statute, whether it was enacted before or after the Bill of Rights. So one effect of the Bill of Rights, which applies only to who? Natural persons, is to prescribe a firm rule for the resolution of a conflict between the Bill of Rights and another statute. So what was the essence of my court case? There was an order that I was there as a human being, natural person, Canadian Bill of Rights. So what we had was a conflict between a natural person protected by the Canadian and the Income Tax Act. Who do you think is going to win? Well, she already knew what the law said. She goes, if the conflict is between a Bill of Rights and another statute, the Bill of Rights must, in all cases, prevail over the conflicting statute. That's why she said, don't worry, sit down. It was game over. So that's some tools you're going to need. We're going to have a break here. Memorize all that stuff so when we come back, we can go into these acts. Again, when you see it for yourself, we're looking to empower you with the knowledge of that. So let's have a 15-minute break and we'll come back here. What we're going to do in the second half now is take what you learned in the first half. And again, you may not have memorized, but when you start seeing it being applied, it should come back to you. What we looked at the first half really is probably the most important aspect of all this is who you are in this legal system. Because you need to know that when we start looking at these laws. And so how do the laws actually relate to you? And what is it about your human rights that attaches you to these laws and stuff? So we're going to start focusing this into income tax. And we're going to look at the GST Act a little bit and at the Income Tax Act. So before we get into the acts, though, I want to go through a few of the questions that really are commonly asked, because it's amazing. We've all been trained by the same TV and the same media and the same things. We all end up with the same fundamental beliefs about income tax, right? So as the years progress, we started realizing there's really three main ones that we hear. Somebody, you know, if you talk to somebody about this, go, well, what about this? What about this? So we're going to go through a few of them, and then we're going to go through some other aspects, too, before we get into it. Here's one question we hear a lot is, well, if we don't pay income tax, how will we run the country? Makes sense, right? Because what are we taught? It's our income tax that pays for everything, right? Well, the reality of it is there's like over almost 200 different taxes here. We're only talking about one or two of them here. The answer to this question is really simple. The way it was designed. Our government would print and issue currency based on the natural resources of this country, loan it to itself interest-free, and would collect import and export taxes as this nation's productions are sold. I mean, there's a lot of legitimate taxation structures in this country. Pay back the loan to itself, pay its operating costs, and anything left over would come back to the people in the form of services and dividends, all in balance with nature. That's why we say this is a great country. Our design is an excellent design. There's nothing really that needs to be changed at the structure of this country. We just need to see through illusion at the other end of it. To go further into this, though, we can support this to Canada's 1993 Auditor's General Report. They're talking about the cost of borrowing, our federal government borrowing money. So they go here, it goes from Confederation from 1867 to 1991-92, the federal government accumulated a net debt of $423 billion. That's a lot of money. We don't even relate to that reality, right? What is $1 billion? Okay, but it's a lot of money. Of this, though, only $37 billion represents the cumulative shortfall in meeting the cost of government programs since Confederation. So to run this country, we only actually really borrowed $37 billion to pick up the pieces. The remainder, the $386 billion, represents the amount the government has borrowed to service the debt created by previous annual shortfalls. So what happened? We relinquished the right to print and issue currency to the private bankers. We went to the private bankers to borrow money. We borrowed $37 billion, and well, we're stuck with $386 billion worth of interest costs. You think there's something going on here? And this story here really doesn't show you the true picture, because what it does, it goes back to 1867, but what we learned earlier was, yes, our country was founded in 1867. We did not have income tax for 87 years, I believe it is. 46 years, sorry. 46 years to 1913 is when the Bank Act was passed. At this point in time, our debt was $50 million. Not bad, right? We built a national railroad, pipeline, the whole bit. We even fought in wars, the whole bit. In 4 years, by 1917, after they relinquished the right to print and issue currency, this $50 million jumped to $2.2 billion. Okay, and now we're in 96, 97, it's $423 billion. Is it lower today? It was never designed. It was designed for the world bankers to get economic control over our country. And it's not the same thing, it's not an isolated thing to Canada. The same thing's in the States. In 1984, Ronald Reagan, he commissioned the Grace Report, because they were having suspicions about their income tax system too. And the basic conclusion of their whole report, the whole report's on the website, but the conclusion basically is, with 2/3 of everyone's personal income tax wasted or not collected, 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by the interest on the federal debt and by the government's contribution to transfer payments. In other words, all individual income tax revenues are gone before one nickel is spent on the services which taxpayers expect from their government. So when someone says, how are we going to run our country? We'd run our country a lot better if we got rid of the income tax system, because that means we'd have to get rid of the private bankers. Again, Ronald Reagan, some great quotes over the years when he was alive. He goes, our federal tax system is, in short, utterly impossible, utterly unjust, and completely counterproductive. It reeks with injustice, and it's fundamentally un-American. It has earned a rebellion, and it's time we rebelled. And that's the president of a country. Who are they going to rebel against? The private bankers. So when we start seeing the real problems behind what income tax is, then we can start actually addressing it properly. Here's question 2. Actually, this is probably my favorite. You start laughing when you hear people. If we don't pay income tax, what about the roads? Since I started doing this, I've never met so many people who have a passionate connection to the roads. It's just amazing. You ask about, you start talking about income tax. Well, what about the roads? I mean, they don't even pause for a thought. They don't take a breath. It's just, well, what about the roads? Imagine how well we've been trained to repeat what they want us to repeat. So really, the answer to the first question should answer this one. But to be more specific, roads come from gas taxes, not income taxes. They go to the world bankers. There's a lot of great information on it. Canadian Taxpayer Federation, 1999, they did this whole expose on it. Their gas tax honesty day. One of the facts, there's a lot of them, but one of them is really glaring of what the real problem is. It goes, Ottawa spends only 5% of its share of gas tax revenues on Canadian roads. In 1996-97, federal government collected $4,023 million. See, that's why really it's $4 billion, but we understand it better that way. In fuel taxes, yet they only spent $289 million on highways. So the real question we should be asking, if they collected over $4,000 million and only spent $289 million on highways and construction, where'd the other 92% go for that year and for every year since? It's all an illusion. Again, the roads won't suffer. But, you know, if you really are concerned about the roads, you can always adopt the road and pay for it out of your personal income tax savings. So we got both sides covered on that one. Think of the brooms you could buy. Question 3. Now, this one is really thought-provoking in a sense. You know, a lot of people go, well, I thought Jesus said we have to pay taxes. Is that not what we're taught in churches and stuff, right? Well, I highly doubt Jesus says you have to pay taxes. I believe what he said was, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So the real question we should be asking is, what is Caesar's? And this was a point, you know, got to have been over 10 years ago. I was in a Bible study, and it's funny how everything always ends up talking about taxes. You know, there's 2 verses in the Bible that are brutal. One is Romans 13 says, submit to the authorities. And the other one is, pay unto Caesar what is Caesar's. On the surface, it looks like, well, we got a government, whatever it says, we have to do it. And if it says we pay taxes, we have to do it. And so I almost stopped this whole research, my whole thing in that, because, you know, guess what triggered up inside of me? Guilt. You know, we're programmed really nice. That guilt is like, well, plus fear. I didn't want to go to hell either. So with all those emotions, I almost quit. So the second my mind, really, I remember sitting there, my mind went, I mean, the guilt was just festering there. I was like, okay, I'm going to stop. I'm going to start filing and doing that. The second my mind did that, you know, the question popped in, but what is Caesar's? And what that allowed me to do was say, well, hey, instead of before I make a decision, let me go find out what Caesar's is. And I think if we go down that path, you can really look at it this way. If the government is Caesar, and this country is built on the principles that acknowledge the supremacy of God, then rightfully so, we should render to the government what is the government's. So if the government has an internal income tax system to tax the income of the officer it creates, and if you work as a representative of the officer, then all things being equal, you need to pay the tax due by the officer unto Caesar. That's just what the law is. However, though, in the alternative, if you work in your own capacity for your own benefit and the government, federal or provincial, recognizes the fact that they can't tax your private labor without violating your God-given human rights, then are you violating any spiritual or legal principle if you keep all of your compensation except for what you want to give unto God? So I think if you contemplate your Creator, it ought to become clear that no government has a divine authority to take your property against your free will, as that would itself contradict other spiritual laws like thou shalt not steal. Okay, there's always the balancing in there. Okay, now here's the reality of this income tax. You know, this may be the first time you ever heard anything about income tax being an illusion. That is not what we think it is. But it's not a secret. This illusion of income tax is no secret. We looked at this one quote from our own Prime Minister. He goes, usury once in controllable recognition. They all know what caused it, they all know what started, and they all know what damage it's doing. And it's not even a new battle. It started here in 1913 in Canada, exact same year in the United States. But except for down there it was a little easier. Woodrow Wilson was the president at the time, and he was the president when they passed the Federal Reserve Act, which basically gave the private bankers the right to print and issue the United States currency. Once he realized what he had done, he goes, I'm a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small amount of dominant men. You think they teach that in their high schools down there? Okay? Maybe that's why they got control of our education system too. And it's not a new battle. Okay, the battle that, see, Canada didn't really experience the historical battle with the private bankers, but the United States did. There's a great educational video out there called The Money Masters. You just go type in themoneymasters.com and it's about 3 hours. It'll take you back in the history of money and the whole evolution, the creation of the Rothschilds and really up to the conclusion of the Federal Reserve and look at ways of resolving that. Through their history, Thomas Jefferson, he fought off the private bankers. I think at one point he actually kept them out for about 20 years. And if you go into the U.S. history, virtually every president that got assassinated, it had nothing to do with what was heard on the news. It all had to do with the fight between them and the private bankers. It goes, the privately owned central banks is an institution of the most deadly hostility existing against the principles and form of our Constitution. If the people allow the private banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all their property until their children wake up homeless on the continents their forefathers conquered. So it was a long going battle. He knew the result of allowing them to print and issue the currency. And even the other side, again, they're getting more brazen now. They talk about it. They have quote. Sir Hosea Stamp, he was the president of the Bank of England in the 1920s, the second richest man in England at the time. I think this quote came from near the end of his life when he was starting to feel a little guilty for what he had done. He goes, banking was conceived in inequity and born in sin. The bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create deposits, and with a flick of a pen, they'll create enough deposits to buy it back again. However, take it away from them, and all great fortunes like mine will disappear, and they ought to disappear, for it would be a happier and a better world to live in. But if you wish to remain the slaves of the bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create deposits. See, when we can isolate what the true problem of all this is, we can start focusing our energy on it. If we look at the Rothschild brothers, okay, he was one of the older ones. He goes, give me control of the nation's money, and I care not who makes her laws. Because when you can economically enslave a country, you are truly in control. Horace Greeley was another world banker. He goes, while boasting of our noble deeds, we are careful to conceal the ugly fact that by iniquitous money system, we have a nationalized system of oppression which, though more refined and legal, is not less cruel than the old system of chattel slavery. And that's why a lot of us feel like we're enslaved and we're working half the year for something that really doesn't produce results. Okay? It's the design of the game we're caught up into. Now here's an article out of the Bankers Association. This is 1924. It originated in 1895 and was reprinted in 1934. But this really, again, boils it down into a nutshell of their game, what they're doing. They go, capital must be protected in every way possible. Debts must be collected. Mortgages foreclosed as rapidly as possible. When through the process of law, the common people lose their homes, they'll become more docile and more easily governed through the strong arm of government applied by the central power of wealth under leading financiers. These truths are well known among our principal men who are now engaged in forming an imperialism to govern the world. What do we hear that on the news as? New World Order, one world government, right? By dividing the voter through the political party system. So who do you think created our political party system? The other course goes into looking through that political party system, so what can be done from that aspect too. We can get them to expend their energies in fighting for questions of no importance. And we see that on TV, don't we? You ever watch the Parliament channel? Whatever gets accomplished. My kids fight better than that. Okay, or worse than that, or less than that. Okay, it is thus by discreet action we can secure for ourselves which had been so well planned and so successfully accomplished. And that's how confident they were in 1924. How much more confident do you think they are today? Okay, that is why if we don't wake up soon, it's gonna be too late. And this picture really is worth 1,000 words. It's from the Billions of Bankers booklet. It really shows you, see, if we don't look at the picture in its broad spectrum, we'll turn around and all we'll see is the government. We'll sit there and we'll blame the government, blame the government, blame the government. But the reality of it is the government is nothing more than puppets of these bankers. And that's why if you look at the political party system, it is easier to create political parties and then all you got to do is control the few at the top and make the rest underneath subordinate to them. Now this is a great picture because it just shows you how we feel and all the taxes that we're being whipped to death with. And if we sit there and only blame the government, the bankers, they sit in the background laughing behind us. Okay, we need to look and deal with that problem. There's one thing they missed on this picture, though, is how this thing's all connected to us. It's these nice little carrots, these benefits that we all go and chase after. Well, most of these benefits, they're rotten carrots out there, and when we start looking at them for what they are, we can probably start making a few more decisions on that. So as we progress, we need to first look at what are taxes. Well, like I said, there's over 180 different taxes. But you can take all those taxes, whatever you want to call it, and you can actually boil them down into two categories. Just imagine basically two boxes for taxes. There's either direct taxes or there's indirect taxes. So regardless what the name they give it, excise, this, that, or whatever, they'll boil into there. Because a direct tax is one that's imposed directly upon property according to its value. It is generally spoken of as a property tax or ad valorem. So because a lot of people know that their property is their labor, and so they look at that and they think they're being taxed directly, they say, well, it's a direct tax and it's unconstitutional. So that's sort of the essence of that argument. An indirect tax is a tax upon some right or privilege or corporate franchise. Ordinarily, all taxes paid primarily by a person who can shift the burden upon someone else or who are under no legal compulsion to pay them are considered indirect taxes. So we've got to really look at that. What is taxes and really what is income tax? Which one of these boxes does it actually fall into? Here's out of Black's Law, an income tax. It basically goes here, an income tax is not levied upon property, funds or profits, but upon the right of an individual or corporation to receive income or profits. And again, this is very broad if the use of the word individual means a human being, because this comes out of American and English jurisprudence. In the States, they can tax a natural person because they got a different layer there. Okay? In Canada, they can't. And it explains that in here. It goes, under various constitutional and statutory provisions, a tax on income is sometimes said to be an excise tax, which is an indirect tax, and not a tax on property, which is a direct tax. So Canadian income tax, what is it? All we have to do, when we understand the illusion, it cannot do anything unless it's written down. So if you ever have a question of how can they do something, if you search long enough and hard enough, you'll find it. We just got to go to Canada Customs and Revenue Agency Act 1999, they're now called CRA, and find out what authority, what jurisdiction do they have. It's an act to establish CCRA and amend and repeal other acts as a consequence. The powers, duties, and functions of the minister extend to all matters over which Parliament has jurisdiction. So what does Parliament have jurisdiction over? Direct taxes or indirect taxes? Just indirect taxes. So it's going to say not by law assigned to any department, board, or agency of the government other than the agency relating to duties of customs, which is an excise, duties of excise, stamp duties, internal taxes, unless otherwise provided, including income tax. So what is income tax? It's an internal federal tax. So somehow inside this box is the only place that that income tax system actually exists. As we move forward, before we get into that, we want to also clear up some, how would you say, misconceptions or myths or things that you might hear is because a lot of people are angry about taxes for some reason. I don't know. And so sometimes that anger comes out and say, well, income tax is a big fraud, and it's illegal, and it's this, it's unconstitutional. So we want to go through here and just give you some facts behind that, so when you hear that, you can help correct that person and direct him in the right way. Okay, you'll hear, is the illusion of income tax a fraud? Okay, we look at that. Now it may feel like it, but legally, no, it's not a fraud. And the reason it's fraud, when you start looking at the complexity of the game, is they should have told us all this. But they got this nice little legal maxim that sort of puts a little bit more responsibility on us than we were aware of. It's juris ignoratus est cum jus nostrum ignoramus. It is ignorance of the law when we do not know our own rights. And that's why we spend so much time trying to teach people what your rights are and who you really are. Because when you get to that point, you would tell at a glance that there's no way this thing could have applied to you, because of all your human rights. But without the knowledge of your human rights, you have no idea how to even look at that book. So even though their game is very manipulative, very deceptive and stuff, to build a case for fraud against them, I think would be very hard. Is income tax unconstitutional? Again, I spent 6 years believing it was. I mean, I can argue an unconstitutional argument very well. There's enough stuff out there. Is it though? No. Income tax is a federal internal tax, making it an indirect tax, which is only applicable to the federal created artificial persons known as an officer. That's all income tax is. And it's well within its constitutional boundaries. Was income tax supposed to be temporary? How many people here were ever taught in school income tax was only a temporary measure? Right? Okay. Well, what's the truth behind that? Was it? No. It was never even supposed to be. Here's just a snippet out of this Committee of the Whole, July 25th, 1970. Sir Thomas White, Minister of Finance, discussing the introduction of income tax. He goes, I have placed no time limit upon this measure, but merely have placed upon the hands the suggestion that a year or two after the war is over, the measure should be reviewed by the Minister of Finance of the day with the view of judging whether it is suitable to the conditions which then prevail. What do you think he decided? Okay, it was never even intended at the... So you got to learn, why would they teach us it was temporary? I remember in grade 10 being taught it was temporary. Because if you can teach everybody it's temporary, we'll say, okay, well, we'll just go keep busy over here. Right? Rather than getting in there and saying, hold it, what's going on here? Now, is the income tax illegal? If you progress in your education down this path, you may run across where some people say, well, you know, you start understanding the construction of statutes, and it needs a preamble and an enacting clause. It definitely needs an enacting clause to go from a bill to become an act, to have any force or effect. So you go get an income tax book and you'll find it doesn't have an enacting clause. So there's a lot of people saying, well, it's illegal because there's no enacting clause. It hasn't been properly brought forward. When we look at that, is it illegal? The answer to that is no. The originating Income War Tax Act has the required enacting clause, and today's version is just an amended version of the original. That's why they needed to get that in. And if you go through this book, or anyone, with a lot of footnotes, you'll see it always makes reference back to 1948, and 1917, all the way back. This is what happened. The original war income tax is about that thick, maybe 38 pages, 39 pages. This is what happened when we fell asleep, right? Let it grow. So it's not illegal from that perspective. Now, is income tax voluntary? It's not a yes or no answer. That depends. It's the only question that only you really can answer on that. Are you working in your own capacity for your own benefit, or in the capacity of a legal representative of a federally created artificial person for its benefit? So it depends what your answer is. If you're working in your own capacity for your own benefit, of course it's voluntary. Okay, because it's connected to a benefit program. They can't force you to take the benefit, and it would violate your rights if they ever try to force it upon you mandatory. But if you're working as a legal representative of an artificial person who receives the benefit, of course it's not voluntary, because you're receiving the quid pro quo, the benefit for it. Okay? So now here's probably it's actually losing its force and effect, but even about a year ago, is their #1 piece of propaganda in relation to natural person and the Income Tax Act. Because about 6 months before I went to court, and like I say, there was groups all across this country studying this stuff. Well, one fellow was named Thomas Kennedy, and he had a fellow named Dave Lindsay go do a court case for him. Thomas Kennedy was a school teacher in Ontario. And so again, as this information was being picked apart by people across the country, Thomas Kennedy took CCRA to court, so there's a big clue, took CCRA to court and tried to get his money back. Okay? So in this case, we understand this case came with a different conclusion, but we need to understand the case. So did the judge find a natural person was a person in the income tax in the Kennedy case? In this case, in equity, yes. In this case, he did. But we need to understand the case. If you go through the case law, the website, we've gone through and unspun every section. The nice thing about this, see, when this case happened, it was 6 months before I went to court, and it really took the wind out of a lot of people's sails who were researching this stuff because it looked so black and white. I looked down and said, this is great because it allows us to get inside the mind of a judge. And before I made it to court, I went through every reason he had for judgment, and I was able to unspin it and see what he actually said. It's amazing what we read and what was actually written. So just some, we don't have time to get into the intricacies of this one, but if you really go through it, just from what we learned, even in the first part of this course, he goes, he had to go back to 1831 case law to support his findings. Because in 1831, because his basis for his findings were statutes are read in their natural and ordinary meaning, which means you just pick them up and read them, and you apply all the natural meanings. Well, we just realized you can't do that anymore, but back then you could. So he went back to there. And he repeatedly stated that he was driven to his conclusions based on the information provided. See, this was not a case of what is law and what isn't law. This was a civil case, effectively. Okay, and who's the burden of proof on? The person who brings the charge, the claim. Well, Kennedy took them to court, so the burden of proof was on Kennedy. And because this information wasn't developed at that time, he didn't have enough pieces to put the whole puzzle together. It was the responsibility of Kennedy to give the judge sufficient information to rule appropriately, as the judge could only consider the evidence presented because they were in a court of equity, not a court of law. This is, when you understand this, is if two people went to court and say the argument was ice was hot. Okay, so the guy went in there, he laid out a beautiful case to prove that ice was hot, and the other guy showed up and didn't present anything or didn't present enough. The judge could literally rule that ice is hot. That doesn't make it the truth. It makes it a fact within the case. And that's all that really happened in here. So in this case, yes, but in law, no. The other course goes a little bit deeper. You actually can see it for yourself. But it's a great case when you want to see how the game is played. So those are some of the myths and things that you may come across. Some things is illegal, it's a fraud, it's unconstitutional. Help direct them back onto the right track and move them down so they get some facts behind it. We want to drift into this GST Act. We saw earlier, right, when we looked at the GST Act, says individual means a natural person. So we know what a natural person is, and we know that's us as a human being. So we know we're in this act. And person, whenever they use the word person, it means the natural person, a partnership, a corporation, and a bunch of other stuff. So we want to see now, what are we taught in society as the common knowledge of GST? Who gets a GST number? Anybody that has in business, unless they make what? Less than $30,000 a year. So is that a lie? No, that's the truth. But you know what it is? It's not the whole truth. You see, you don't have to lie to people. You just give them enough for them to hang themselves. If we go into the act itself and find out, do we even have to register? What is the requirements to even register to collect GST? Section 241, it goes, every person who makes a taxable supply in Canada in the course of a commercial activity engaged in by the person in Canada is required to be registered for the purpose of this part, except where, and that's that small supplier stuff. Now, we're all intelligent. We just read that, and we actually know what that meant, don't we? And this is where it's like, when we're aware of how the game is played, we will actually slow it down. We'll go in and say, well, what if they played word magic here? So we go in and we look at a taxable supply. It means a supply that's made in the course of a commercial activity. If we stop here and assume we know what a commercial activity is, well, I make money, so that must be a commercial activity, then we're still trapped. Sometimes, see, that's why I was saying the permissible presumption that no act of law will hurt you, that will give you the motivation to keep going deeper because you know they can't hurt you. That just means it's hidden deeper. So if we go deeper and go to what's a commercial activity then? Commercial activity of a person means a business carried on by the person other than a business carried on without reasonable expectation of profit by an individual, which is what? A natural person, a personal trust or partnership, all the members of which are natural persons. So if they could, why would they have to put the escape? Because you cannot force this upon a natural person. So let's backspin this and see if it fits. If you were carrying on a business without reasonable expectation for profit in your capacity as a natural person, would you have commercial activity? No, you'd fall outside the definition. So if you're not carrying on a commercial activity, then you're not making a taxable supply, and if you're not making a taxable supply, then you're not even required to register. So the only really question that remains to be answered in here is, do you have a reasonable expectation of profit? Now, what are we taught in society? How many people would like to have a very profitable year next year? Profit's good, right? What is profit? We need to look at that first. I hope you're realizing is like, as we go, it's like we need to quit assuming we understand what they're saying. Okay? Do you have a reasonable expectation of profit? Well, profit, the definition is very simple. It goes the advance in the price of goods sold beyond the cost purchased. The gain made by the sale of produce or manufactures after deducting the value of labor, materials, rents, and all expenses together with the interest of the capital employed. So after, basically, it's what's left at the end of the day after everything's paid for. So you got to ask yourself, do you have a reasonable expectation of profit? Say you made something, you sold it for $10,000. Say you spent a couple grand on material. You hired a natural person to work with you so you didn't have all that bureaucratic employee red tape. Paid him $1,000. Okay? You're part of this equation. How much are you worth? How much are you going to pay yourself? So you got profit? Did you even have a reasonable expectation of profit? So when you look at that is, who can determine whether you are making profit or not? The courts have already ruled. CCRA has no authority to deem anybody has a reasonable expectation of profit. That is left up to each individual. See, value is something that is rarely, I don't think I've ever seen it argued. Let's look at it like this. How much is this pen worth? 10,000 bucks? Do I hear 11? 12. Okay, 12 over there. You see, if he paid 12 grand for this, it's a private agreement. Value is an elusive thing. So when you really look at knowing who you are and the value of yourself, maybe this really explains why we're taught in school. You know, kids come out of school with very beat up self-esteems and stuff like that. Oh, you're only worth this or you're only worth that, right? But when you really know who you are, you got to ask yourself a question: how much is a natural person worth? If you paid yourself $7,000 for every one of these sold, is that too much? How much are we each worth? Well, if we're all equal, and here's what we get back to: if we're all equal, and some guy out there makes $1 million a day, does that not mean we all could at least make that? And when you understand as a society, we do value human life. Think about when somebody gets lost in the mountains or out in the sea or wherever it is, right? We don't question. We just send out. We spend hundreds of thousands looking for people. The value of a human life, when you understand who you are. See, if you mask yourself with all these titles, you don't see the value. You only see the market value of that title. But when you know who you really are and you put that into the equation, you'll never have profit. This actually cleared up because years in construction, I played the tax game for about 10 years. And I, like everybody else, was raised looking for profit. So I do my books and I do all the deductions and all this. And at the end of the time, I had a pile of money left on the thing. I'm going, okay, I know I'm supposed to make profit. How much of that is profit and how much of that is my wages? So once I figured it out, I went, had a bad year, no more profit. It's a really, now again, incorporated companies' whole existence is for making profit. Because they're not a human being, okay? Anything they make is above and beyond. Because they haven't put anything out like we as human beings put out. So that's really, it's funny because GST is so simple to unspin. Because we can just read it for what it is. It actually, very clear, it uses natural person in there. Right? But it has probably caused more damage to this country and the people of this country in the short time it's been instituted here than income tax has. So as easy as into unspin, it's a lot more brutal aspect of it. But we're going to move into the Income Tax Act and really answer a question for you. Here's how you can work for the federal government without taking civil service exam. So if you hate tests and you still want to have a government, here's how you do it. You go and you sign up for their good old Canada pension plan. Let's look at what the words mean in this act and really start comparing them to what they mean when we normally use them. Employee includes an officer. Does it include anything else? No. Okay, if you can't accept the word includes and it says, let's remove all principles of interpretation. We go, the natural and ordinary meaning of employee is what? Anybody that works for anybody else plus an officer. Let's collapse everything. Okay, well ask yourself, why would they just remind us about officers? Why not firemen, teachers, businessmen? No, when we understand the restrictive use of it, whenever you see the word employee, it only means an officer, which is an artificially created entity. What's an employer? It means a person liable to pay salary or wages, remuneration for services performed in employment, and, which is what you're seeing as a compound sentence, so it's not this plus that, it's this is this and that, and in relation to the officer includes the person from whom the officer receives remuneration. So the employer first has to have a relationship to an officer before he's even deemed an employer under the Canada Pension Plan Act. Okay? What's employment? What's the normal meaning of the word employment? Just the act of being employed, going to work. It means but in here, it means the performance of services under an expressed or implied contract of service or apprenticeship, comma, and includes the tenure of an office. So who's the contract of service with? Good old federal government. That's how you get a nice contract of service job, making them your master, you're the slave, so you can hold this office as an officer. So that's the benefit plan that actually creates income tax. See, income tax in itself, you don't see it as a benefit, but it's connected to a benefit. It's actually a unique benefit plan when you look at that. So we've got to look at how are we related to that as a natural person. Can they force us to get one of these social insurance card or work in this office under a contract? If you go into the regulations, 3.1 of the regulations go, every individual who is required by the Act. See, the sentence structure itself just told you that what's an individual. It's not redefined, so it actually is a natural person. Every natural person is required by the Act. The sentence structure itself just told you that not all natural persons are required by the Act. So what would you be doing that would make you required by the Act? Well, maybe you were holding an office as an officer for remuneration under a contract of service. If you're doing that, then you're required by the Act to get a social, and you must have a social insurance number. So if you're going to receive that benefit, they need to track it, and therefore they can force the number upon you. And that's how come you see sometimes they'll come in and force a number on somebody who doesn't know who they are. Now, is it bad having the social insurance card with us? You know, the social insurance card, I hope you see, is very neutral. It actually accesses many other federal government benefits. I look at it as a debit card into many of the systems, and each one of them are for different entities. Section 4 clears that up. It goes, every individual who expects to be an individual required. What they're saying here is that expect is a predicatory word. Okay, they're saying if you even expect that one day you may want to hold an office as an officer so you can get CPP, you may apply for one of the cards and carry it around with you, just so you have it. See, the card itself is very neutral. So just by having it is not a detrimental aspect. Just a little bit look at what the social insurance card really is. It means a social insurance number means a social insurance number assigned to a natural person under the authority of any act of Parliament, and social insurance number card means the social insurance number card issued to the natural person under that authority. There are many acts. The other course goes into a lot of the different arenas that your social insurance card is for. And so it doesn't in and of itself represent a singular entity. It gives you access to represent an officer, an insured person, a student, a purchaser, many different ones. So when you look at the card, and that's why they brought it in before they connected to the Income Tax Act, because it was a variable card. And then 3 years after they brought it in, they connected it in 1967 to the Income Tax Act. So that brings us into the Income Tax Act now. And we're going to look at these words. I just threw them all up so you're going to see what we're going to look at. Basically, we're going to look at the word business, corporation, employed, employee, employer, employment, individual, legal representative, officer, person, salary, wages, and taxpayer. We're going to look into these words before we read the Income Tax Act, first so we can understand what these words are saying. The reality of it is, just with this few words, you don't even get past Section 2 of the Income Tax Act before you realize it had nothing to do with you in the first place. Okay, and this is actually one of the few acts that actually has the definition section hidden way in the back. Go figure why. So we want to draw a picture here. What does the Income Tax Act actually say? Section 248 is the definition section, and these are the most important words in that definition section in this act. So when we look at words, that's what they mean in this act. That's not what they mean on the job or over there, but that's what they mean in this act and out of the mouths of anybody who speaks with authority from this act. Okay? First word we're going to look at is business. I'm going to draw some little pictures here to give you a visual of how this works. Now, I like the word business here because when you look at it, there's a couple reasons why they even have to put the word in the act. Business includes a profession, calling, trade, manufacture, undertaking of any kind, whatever. Is that not broad? Okay, I mean, that's just basically, I look at it as like going to the bathroom's an undertaking of any kind, you know. It even has paperwork. Maybe we're taxed on that, right? But think about it too. I mean, when you look at it, is doing nothing an undertaking of a kind? You see, so why did they use, well, here's why, because business in law has no definite or legal meaning. It's a neutral word, so whenever it's being used, it has to actually be defined to give it some meaning. Okay? But what they did is they said business means basically anything and everything you can do. And then it goes on to say, and in the nature of a trade, but does not include an office or employment. So you're seeing the reverse use of the word includes. They said business includes everything, but does not include this circle and this circle. So they actually used it to be able to use it and pull these 2 points out. Okay, so we're going to be looking at those 2 words as we go. So we're going to look at a business. We're going to look at this other word, corporation. What's the natural and ordinary meaning of the word corporation when we use it just talking on the streets? Is McDonald's a corporation? IBM? We use corporation. We think everybody's talking about an incorporated company. Remember what happened, though, in federal statutes? Corporation in federal statutes means artificial person. So because they wanted to mean just the incorporated company, corporation includes an incorporated company to restrict it, just, which is one type of many artificial persons. It's funny because we were talking to this tax attorney, actually, a person just passed law school, so they're just brand new and focused, specialized in tax. So we're talking about definition. I said, well, why'd they put the word corporation in there? You know, it just says what we normally think it means. He goes, oh, just for clarity, just to remind us. Okay. If that's what you're taught, good. Okay. But keep that thought in there. If they're going to put this in there, just to remind us, just for clarity, keep that thought, because we're going to see, we're going to need that premise to look at other words. Okay, we're going to move on in there. In this act, employed means performing the duties of an office or employment. So what we have here is we have an incorporated company. What we're trying to find is, are we in here as natural persons? And so in this act, to be employed means you're performing the duties of an office. Whoops. Oh well. Or employment. Now, we're going to have to dissect them, but think about the language now. CCR phones you up and says, are you employed? What did they just say to you? Did they say, are you working for somebody? No, they asked you when they say, are you employed or have you been employed in the last year or whatever they ask you, what they're asking you is, they said, are you performing the duties of an office or employment as defined within this act? Okay, so it becomes very restrictive. So basically, I know who I am and I know who he is. He's been unemployed for I don't know how many years. See, I have not been performing the duties of an office or employment. So unemployed, not employed, whatever you want to call it, means you're just not doing that. It doesn't mean you're not working. Okay? Now, what's an employee? It includes an officer. So if you're a business person, CCR phones you up, do you guys have any employees? What did they just ask you? Do you have any officers there? Because if you do, we want to track them. Okay, so we draw our picture more and we say, okay, if an employee, where was the only other place we saw the word employee? CPP Act. That's about the only place you'll see it within that. So it should make sense. We'll put the officer in the office. Okay? Makes sense. Let's go a little bit deeper. What's an employer? Okay, normal meaning of employer is someone who hires somebody else. Right? You're an employer when you have someone babysit your kids or someone cut your yard, technically, right? But in this act, when they use the word employer, means in relation to an officer, means the person from whom the officer receives remuneration. So if you're even if you're an incorporated company and you got a relationship to one of these officers, you've hired them, you are then within the act an employer. But what if you broke these relationships and went under private agreements with a bunch of natural persons? Would there be a relationship to an officer? Then would you be even classified as an employer under that act? Okay, well then would you be required to do payroll? Keep payroll records? You see what payroll records really are is because you're taking the benefit of using one of their government officers, they want you to track so they can make sure they take care of their benefit. That's all payroll records are. Payroll records over here is just between the two parties. Okay, and if you're deducting something from one of these officers and you're not remitting it to the government, that's a trust account. It's money you should have had, and they want it right away. Let's look at this word employment. What's employment? Normal meaning just means you're out there working. Remember, it actually was something different in the CPP Act, but in here they've even narrowed it. Employment means the position of an individual in the service of some other person, including Her Majesty or foreign state or sovereign, and servant or employee, which are synonymous, which is really the same thing, means the person holding such a position. So when we look at that, it means the position of an individual. Now our mind should have gone individual. I wonder if that means a natural person. But when we even read on within it, we can realize that individual is used in different contexts. The position of an individual, which is a singular, in the service of some other person, and servant or employee means that person or that individual holding such a position. So in employment, there's only two things that can be employed, is the servant or the employee. We already know the employee is the officer. That only leaves the servant over here. And what you're going to see really is even inside the box there's a duality within the box. And we can relate to that in life as it goes. And there's really only one entity under this whole Income Tax Act. How about this office in this act? Office. Okay, now what's the normal meaning of the word office? What, 9 by 12, picture window, a couple rubber tree plants, you know? Well, in this act, it doesn't mean that. In this act, an office means the position of an individual, entitling the individual to fixed or ascertainable stipend or remuneration. So it's a position held by one of these persons, an officer or a servant. And includes, see, they know how to use includes in the proper point, and includes a judicial office, the office of a minister of the Crown, the office of a member of the Senate or House of Commons of Canada, a member of the Legislature Assembly, a member of the Legislature or Executive Council, and any other office, the incumbent of which is elected by popular vote. Have you been elected? Or is elected or appointed in a representative capacity, and also includes the position of a corporation director, comma, and, which is a compound sentence, and officer means a whole person holding an office. So basically, I don't care what you call it, it still is an officer holding that office. So however you spin it, there's only one entity here, it's the officer. All a servant is, if you look at it, is an officer is basically an employee of a servant is your self-employed. So here's your T4 world, and here's your T4A plus your self-employed world. Okay? But they're still both under a contract with service with the federal government for CPP. Okay? They're still federal government entities, employment. Okay? Now, so we look at this, the act, it has the word person redefined. So are we in here? Now, remember what the tax attorney said, why they used the word corporation in there? Just to remind us. Well, don't you think they would have just put the word natural person in here too, just to remind us? So let's look at it. See if we're in under the definition of person. Person or any word or expression descriptive of a person, comma, includes any corporation. Well, that's not us. And any entity exempt because of section 149(1) of the tax under part 1 of all or part of the entity's taxable income. Well, that's your churches, charitable donations stuff, so that's not us. Okay? And the heirs, executors, administrators, and as a connective to this, okay, those three, or as a break and start of a new sentence, or other legal representatives of such a person. Now, we look at this on the surface and go, legal representative, well, that's lawyers and stuff, so we're not lawyers, so that's not even us. But if we slow down and say, well, what if maybe we should check all these words and see if we can find a different meaning? And what if we're a legal representative of such a person? When you look at that is, if you're a legal representative of this person, then you are not the person itself, but you're somehow connected to that person. So let's look at this word legal representative. Legal representative of a taxpayer. So right there it shows you, is the legal representative the taxpayer? No. It's a legal representative of the taxpayer, means a trustee in bankruptcy. That's not us. An assignee, that's not us. A liquidator, I think someone drinks a lot, that's not us. Curator, no. A receiver of any kind. Now that's really broad. Have you received anything throughout your life for the taxpayer? Okay. Maybe we fit into here. A trustee, an heir, an administrator, an executor, a committee, or any other like person. Here's an example how the word person doesn't carry the definition in, because they go any other like person. The like makes it any of this list. Anything similar to that. Administrating, winding up, controlling, or otherwise dealing in a representative or fiduciary capacity with the property that belongs or belonged to, or that is or was held for the benefit of the taxpayer or the taxpayer's estate. So if you're not the taxpayer, but you might have received something for them, think about it. Have you ever received anything that may be like a T4 or anything like that? So whose property was that? Was that actually yours? Or was it the entity's, therefore putting you, its legal representative, with fiduciary responsibilities to perform? So now they're coming after you to perform the duties for the taxpayer. That's why it's easier to leave him unemployed and you don't have all that paperwork. So we looked at that word individual, and I want to explore that a little deeper because it's really important to be able to establish, is it us or not? Well, it would be really clear if they went individual means a natural person. That would be really clear. but it's fairly ambiguous, even if we don't even apply principles of interpretation. Individual means a person other than a corporation. So whenever you see the word individual in the Income Tax Act, it means all the persons other than that, other than the incorporated company. Okay? Now we look at the word taxpayer. Are we a taxpayer? Does it say taxpayer includes a natural person or what? A taxpayer includes any person. Any person from where? Any person as defined from within the Act, whether or not liable to pay tax. So you start looking at words like this. See, words that end in EE and ER and OR and stuff, they're called neutral words. They could actually mean a natural person. And think about, this is why they had to actually define it within the Act. Because if they did not redefine the word or limit the word of taxpayer, think about it this way. If your kid goes to the store, say they're 9 or 10, they go to the store, they buy a toy, they pay GST on that toy, do they not pay a tax? So would that not just make them a taxpayer? You see, the word taxpayer is so broad that when they wanted to use it, they had to define it to limit it to just mean a person within this Act, whether they're liable to pay tax or not. So when we look at these words person, and like the Principles of Interpretation says, it means this word rolled back up into there. You don't take person and go off and pick up some natural and ordinary meaning. You roll it back within it. Okay, so the only way we really fit into this is, so far, and these guys get paid remuneration or whatever, but we want to explain that a little bit deeper. How many people here have ever received salary and wages? Now, good. At this point, nobody should be willing to put up their hand for anything. This is hard teaching. Okay? Well, what's the normal meaning of salary and wages? Just being paid. You see how they take words we use in our normal language, they give them a meaning, and they talk to us, and we think we know what they're saying. But in here, in this Act, salary and wages means, except in Section 5 6, and 63, the definition of death benefit in the section means, so salary and wages means the income of a taxpayer from an office or employment. That's all salary and wages. These guys all get salary and wages. And all it means is the money that these officers and servants make. That's it. It doesn't mean what you make doing the things you want. Okay? But does not include supervising. So they even exempt a few things that it doesn't have to. Basically, what you're seeing here is this is how the tax system works. You have to be holding an office, either self-employed, or as an officer. See, when you're a servant of the federal government. When you're an officer of an employer who's connected to the federal government. Okay? And you get all salary and wages. Now you go, well, how about my rental income, my investment income, and everything else I make on all the peripherals? How does that get shoved in through the office? Real simple when you understand word magic. One little word. Salary and wages means the income of a taxpayer from an office or employment and includes all fees received for services not rendered in the course of the taxpayer's business. So whatever you're doing here, everything else you make gets funneled through this word fees and then funnels back up through and becomes taxable. That's about it. There is your internal federal income tax system. It's all connected. We'll draw the line here. It stays inside the federal government. You actually have to go into the federal jurisdiction to receive the benefit of CPP, voluntarily represent an officer to hold an office. Income tax basically is the consideration or partial consideration for holding the office. And when you're inside, they're in control. This is the big monster that has scared us all the living daylights out. But because they're using words that we think we know, and all they did was change all that language. Okay? Now, when you look at it, is this bad? No, if you like the game, play the game. But what if you worked out here? Are you even in their jurisdiction? Do they even have the authority to talk to you or get your books in here? Okay, again, the other course goes into that division of jurisdiction. There's a whole nother layer, but that's it. Almost, it's funny because when you look at the years that this has hurt people in this country and you actually see it for what it is, it's like, that's all it is? To me, it's very anticlimactic. And it may be hard to believe. I mean, that's how simple the truth is, and it may be hard to believe. So you want to look for other proofs of this illusion. Now, here's the simplest form of proof you ever need. This is about as simple as you can get to prove that this Income Tax Act does not and cannot apply to you as a natural person. The most striking evidence is the simple fact that if the Income Tax Act were to directly apply to a natural person for the compensation received for his benefit for the work he did in his capacity as a natural person, then the Income Tax Act would be in violation of the Canadian Bill of Rights, period. Because nowhere in any of its 2,452 pages can you find, in prescribed form, any express declaration that the income tax can operate notwithstanding, in spite of the Canadian Bill of Rights. That's all you need to know. Someone says you have to pay income tax, and you know who you are, and you know the Canadian Bill of Rights in Section 2, you say, fine, I'll pay you as much as you want as soon as you show me the section in here that says this thing's allowed to operate, in spite of the Canadian Bill of Rights, basically allowed to infringe on my human rights. That's about as simple as it gets. But our human nature, we have a tendency to complex things, so we need complexity to make us feel better, I guess. So we need to go a little bit deeper and start looking at it. All this stuff here, you know, is it a fact that a natural person isn't in that act? Can we prove that? Well, first thing we need to establish is what is a fact. When you realize there's a difference between a fact and the truth. Okay, I like this as like, why is a green tree green? Because we all agree it is. What color is this leaf here? See? Until we all come to that point of agreement, it's not a fact. A fact is completely different than the truth. Realize, what side of the road do we drive on? We all drive, I know my left from right, so it's a bad example, but we all drive on one side. See, in our country, that's a wrong example, right? That's a fact. But in England, if we went to and say, no, this is a fact. No, it's not. In a fact, they drive on the other side over there. You see, a fact needs a common acceptance of it. So we start looking at what are facts within our legal system, our language and everything. We start looking at the different areas and start looking at rules in a different light. We start seeing rules are good as long as they're designed to enslave us. Rules allow us to live together in harmony a little bit. So here's some rules of English construction. Capitalization. Always capitalize proper nouns, refer to specific person, place, or things. That's what we're taught as a rule so we can communicate. So we know when we all look at this, Art, Don, Bill, Frank, we look at that and guess what? We all just, you know, after years of studying this stuff, we realize those are names. Because what are these without capitalization? Art, something you hang on the wall. Dawn, something that happens in the morning. Bill, something you throw in the garbage, right? Frank, that's how you talk to CCRA when you understand this stuff. Here it is. Okay? So you start seeing we need rules so we can communicate in a society. Doesn't make them the truth. Truth is a completely different thing. So let's look at some rules for mathematical interpretation, because you've got to understand too is our logic sometimes can override and blind us from the facts. Facts come from a different structure. So let's look at this. Like, we're taught to see if we commingle rules, then we can get a wrong conclusion, because we're taught to read from left to right. Okay? So we do math from left to right. 4 plus 4 is 8 times 4. 4 plus 4 is 8 times 4 is 32. That sounds logical, feels good. We did it right. Okay? But let's break the rules, okay? And let's do it backwards. 4 times 4 is what? 16 plus 4 is 20. So what feels right with this one, right? Because we didn't have to break what we saw as rules. But when we understand principles of mathematical interpretation, we start seeing the importance of following rules. It's called BODMATs, brackets off, division, multiplication, addition, subtraction. We've got to do them in that order. So regardless where it shows up, the rules say you do brackets, then division, then multiplication first. 4 times 4 is 16, plus 4 is 20. So regardless what we think, we need to understand the importance of following the rules. Now the reason I went through that is when we go back into the Income Tax Act or into the principles of interpretation, we can use the principles of interpretation to prove that a natural person is not, nor was intended to be in the Income Tax Act. First thing we got to stop at, as we looked at earlier, what is the natural legal meaning of individual? Individual, person under the Canadian Bill of Rights, the right of the individual extends to natural persons only. So what we're seeing here, not to corporations, puts that little warning. So basically, whenever you see the word individual in a statute, it means a natural person, for most part, unless it's redefined. Okay? So that's our base of going into the legal world and looking at it. Now let's go to the Income Tax Act. We saw this earlier. Individual means a person other than a corporation. Really quite ambiguous, right? So, well, here's your first question. If they wanted it to mean a natural person in the first place, why did they redefine it? Okay, so that's one question you can ask. But let's go down to this other thing we looked here, Excise Tax Act. Individual means a natural person. But you see how clear this is? Why didn't they do that there? Okay, they know these principles of interpretation. They know the rules and the laws they have to follow. We looked at this before the break, 15.2b primarily. Where an enactment contains an interpretation section or provision, it must, by law, be read and construed as being applicable to all other enactments relating to the same subject matter unless a contrary intention appears. So when we understand this law here, we can start looking and seeing their thinking behind here. Because here's a great question on this one. Why would they define a word to what it normally means in law? Why would they do that? Waste ink? Why wouldn't they just put this into here? When you understand this, what they're saying here is, if this word, or this word by law, would mean the same thing in this act if it was not redefined. And vice versa. This word by law would mean the same thing in this act unless it was redefined. So because this word doesn't mean a natural person, they had to go and put the redefine individual back to its normal legal meaning to stop this meaning from drifting in. Okay? And then they actually had to put something in here to stop this meaning from drifting in. So you can see by following the rules, you can actually see why they're wasting ink. It's not waste. They know the laws. So that's one you can play with and have fun with. It's you can start seeing the logic, the intent behind their drafting. Now again, let's go back to use that innocent perception, just the form of proof. Just look how easy it is for them to say what they want to mean. We saw this earlier, the Bank Act. Person means a natural person, an entity, personal representative. If we were in there, do you think they could afford a few more letters and ink for letters to put it in there? We're not in there because we can't be in there. They know it. They've known it for years. They just tried to convince us we were by getting us to forget, not teaching us who we were. Okay, pulling that out of our legal system. But again, here we can go a little bit more complex. Remember, anything in the illusion, you will be able to find it written down. So basically what we said here is you have to work as an officer in an officer employment to receive, in order to make taxable income for the taxpayer, right? And income is just the consideration or partial for that, holding that office. If that holds true, we should be able to find a section within statutes to support that. And it's there. Okay, it's section 6.3 out of the Income Tax Act. By understanding principles of interpretation, you'd never even get past 6.3 of the Income Tax Act before you realize what it was. But again, this is something you can have fun with your accountant, but it's not their fault. Okay, one of our educators is an accountant. He's been a CA for 30 years, and we were having an educators meeting about this and dissecting it. We spent a couple hours on this anyways, but he goes, wow, I've been a CA for 30 years, and I've never been able to understand that. Because when we can accept accountants are not taught principles of interpretation. Section 6.3 goes basically the amount received by one person from another during the period while the payee was an officer of or in the employment of the payer on account in lieu of payment or in satisfaction of an obligation arising out of the agreement made by the payer with the payee immediately prior to, during, or immediately after the payee was an officer of or in the employment of the payer shall be deemed for purposes of Section 5. You got that? That's why it says a couple hours we could spin it. But basically, you look at it, payee and payer are neutral words. This allows, in payee we can put in a natural person, but being payer, technically an officer, a natural person can have a business and hire one officer for the government. You'd still have to do payroll, but so it allows for both. But let's look at the payee side. During the period of time while the natural person was an officer, okay, or after the period that the natural person was an officer of a payer shall be deemed, so the amount he's receiving while he's an officer shall be deemed for Section 5. And what's Section 5? Section 5, subject to a taxpayer's income for a taxation year from an office or employment. Okay? So we realize, well, you as a natural person are performing duties of an officer, whatever you make shall be deemed to be taxable income for the taxpayer for the taxation year, okay, to be remuneration for the payee services rendered as an officer. The natural person services rendered as an officer. Or during the period of employment, unless it is established. So what you're seeing here is a default benefit system. The default benefit is CPP, but the obligation is the income tax. So what they're saying is, unless it's established otherwise, everything you make shall be deemed to be remuneration you made performing the duties of an officer. Okay, unless it is established that irrespective of the agreement, if any, under which the amount we received was made or the former legal effect thereof, it cannot reasonably be regarded as being received. Got that? As consideration or partial consideration for accepting the office or entering into the contract of employment. So just even accepting the office, which really is your self-employed area. Okay, as remuneration or partial remuneration for services as an officer, your employee. In consideration or partial consideration for a covenant with reference to what the officer is, officer-employee synonyms, is or is not to do before or after the termination. So whether you have the job or not, you're in the job or not, anything you're supposed to do before or after still lumped under as consideration, which then picks up all these fees and everything else. They got us coming and going, left, right, before we even start work, after work, whatever. It is, and in the law, you can create, in an illusion, you can create no boundaries. Gravity does not exist in an illusion. That is what income tax is, and that's where it's, in the Act it says, is everything you make shall be deemed to be taxable income unless you establish otherwise. And that's where your right to free will comes in. That's what we need to look at, is how can you establish otherwise? And that's where you, by understanding your right to contract, your free will, you take back control. It is very easy to establish otherwise. Okay, the right to contract, which is really another way of saying your free will, with both natural and artificial persons having the right to contract, and a variety of contractual agreements can be formed. Artificial people can contract with artificial people. Artificial with natural. Natural with natural. And natural with artificial. So really, it just keeps, we sometimes can't see the difference unless we slow down and see what's really going on and who we're really connected with. Now again, anything artificial, you'll be able to find it written down. So an artificial person's right to contract, we should be able to find it within statute. If the creator is the government, it'll be in the statute. So in Canada, such rights can be found in the Interpretation Act under the heading of corporations. And what is corporations in federal statutes unless redefined? Artificial persons. So now when we interject the right word into here so we can understand it, in section 21(1) of the Federal Interpretation Act, words establishing an artificial person shall construed as vesting in the artificial person power to sue and be sued, and power to contract and be contracted with by its corporate name. And that is the only difference really between, not all entities, because some entities are created with less rights, but basically a generic entity has as much right to contract as you do. Except for it has to do it in its corporate name, and we can do it in any name we want, because that's our right. And this is where, when we talked about capitalization, I said for the most part they don't follow, adhere to the 3 levels of capitalization until it gets to the point of contract. And that's why when I got to court and all my court papers, the summons was a contract, delay of information was a contract. Then you started seeing them adhere to it a little bit more. So sometimes you get a letter from CCR, it's upper and lower case. It's because it's not a final contract phase stage of it. It's just a communication. Okay? So that's their right to contract. Now, a natural person's right to contract has the right to contract because upon our birth we're endowed with the gift of free will and the natural right of self-determination. How many people here have ever been in an employment situation where the government walks in and says, I deem you an employee? Right? Or you're an employer and says, no, I deem all your self-employed people as employees. Well, where'd they get that right? They got the right because people don't know who they are, and the government's actually walking in deeming all their officers. See, when you're inside this box, your master can come in and say, no, no, we're going to tell you which side of the line you're on. But when you're outside this box, nobody has the right to deem you anything. Okay? Because you have the right to self-determination. Now, this right can be exercised with or without knowledge, okay, to enter into legally binding contracts. The responsibility and the choice is yours. See, you're already using your free will, and you're entering into things you're not aware of. That's what I mean. They know as long as we don't have the knowledge, they'll always have the upper hand. They'll just set the game board up. Okay? And here's some recognition of and protection of it. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And that is so powerful, because when you see one person in this country doing something, that means we're all allowed to do it. Again, you can spend months contemplating that. And again, we see this Sang Chong case, okay, among the normal rights, the natural rights, which are an unmolested pursuit of one's trade or occupation. So when CCR walks in and tries to deem you something, that's a molestation of your occupation. Where'd they get the right? But that is not the taxpayer's right. That is your human right. And when you're structured properly, they now come into force. So and it goes on to say, where restraint is sought to be put upon any person in respective exercise of any of those natural rights, I think it's the duty of the court to assume that the legislature did not intend to interfere with them unless clear and unequivocal words have been used. And that's what we're saying. Just put the words natural person in here and we'll all start paying taxes tomorrow. Okay? Doctrines of contract. Now, to understand employment, we're going to focus on employment relationships, but we need to sort of look at some of the essence behind these doctrines of contract. What they are is they're your right to contract, and it's your most powerful tool. Life is a contract. Whether you know it or not, you probably have entered into a half a dozen or a dozen today, whether it's a quick little agreement. So to understand this right from the legal perspective is still important. So a contract is a legally recognized agreement between two or more persons, giving rise to obligations that may be enforced in the courts. By such an agreement, parties not only restrict their present or future freedom to act by limitations imposed upon themselves. You see, we're doing it all to ourselves by the agreement. They are creating a set of legal rules binding as regards to themselves and only themselves. So that's that power you have, is you can literally take control and deal under these private contracts. But if you're unaware of that, you'll fall into the default benefit system that they created. Okay? So it's expressed in this freedom of doctrine, the freedom of contract. It's the ability of the parties to agree the most advantageous bargain between them without interference from the courts. The courts aren't there to infringe on us. They're there to resolve disputes that we can't resolve amicably. In the 18th century, there was little restriction placed upon this freedom, the philosophy being that men could pursue the interests in the way they saw fit, and that the duty of law was merely to give effect to the intentions of the parties, and this position still finds expression today. We have a powerful right to structure our life and our work relationships however we want. And that sort of segues into this privity of contract, this idea of a private relationship. Okay, it's a doctrine whereby one can enforce contractual rights against another only if one was a party to the contract. Under the general doctrine of privity of contract, no one who is not an original party to a contract is entitled to seek to enforce the terms of the contract or is bound by any of its provisions. So what that is under a private contract, it is a very closed relationship. But when you look at it is, how many people here, what are they called, garnishees? Had a garnishee at work, and then all of a sudden the government comes in and says, we want you to give us 30% or 40% of his pay. Well, if you were just under contract with the employer, where'd they get the authority to come in? So when we look at that relationship, for what this relationship really is, there's the government, you're under contract with the government, and with an employer. And so when you fail in fiduciary sending the money to the government goes to him and says, give me a garnishee, and redirects the money there. See, they're actually a party to this contract. But when you work in your own capacity for your own benefit, they can't come in and say, give us his money. They can if they go to court and get due process of law and prove that you owe them money, but they just can't walk in with a garnishee. And we actually have a letter, like when people are restructured and stuff for garnishees, you know, if their taxpayer still owed a bit of money and they're trying to garnishee, we got the business owner will send him a letter and say, we'll give you all the money as soon as you can send me a letter saving me harmless from breaching this private agreement between us. The letter never comes back. Okay? They understand this stuff very well. Okay? But when we don't, we're connected somehow through a benefit program to them, that's where they get their authority. So that's what we look at. That's what the common option is. What most people are working under is what is now, we call it the common option. We don't even think there's another way out. Because it's the way, you know, you look back, if we didn't have a social insurance number until 1964, how did we work before that? Did we all stand around waiting until we got one so we can go to work? You see, we live in this moment of time, but we don't see it in the bigger picture. Okay? So when we look at that, there was times in our history that there was no connection to this. Okay, so it's now got to the point we don't think we can work without a social insurance number. That's why we call it the common option. Now, if you want, you can voluntarily represent the taxpayer. You can go to work for the taxpayer for the benefits of CPP, because that's all really income tax is connected via. But if you do that, you're going to have to file an income tax return for the taxpayer you represent, because that's part of the whole quid pro quo you're doing. I would highly suggest you learn the limited rights of the taxpayer. A lot of frustration comes from people representing taxpayers and taking their human rights into the taxpayer world. He does not have the rights you have. That's that frustration that we feel. Again, I'd highly recommend you learn the Income Tax Act of Canada. It's a bit of a dry read, but once you get into it. Okay? But look at it like this. Okay? It's a game. You're playing a game. Let's look at it like Monopoly. If you don't read the rules of Monopoly, who's going to win? The banker always wins. Who's winning this game? The banker, ultimately. So again, learn the rules of the game. Obey every law applicable to the taxpayer. Because in reality, you're receiving a benefit, so then what is right is you should fulfill the other side of it. But just remember this, though. The taxpayer is an artificial person. It can't be hurt. It has no feelings. It doesn't even need anything to live. Its creator owns it, and the creator can change the rules at any time. The creator leaves it only with enough to survive. And this is why we're seeing, you know, most people are like, what, 3 months, 6 months away from bankruptcy if you actually lost your job and couldn't get another one? That's the design of this game, okay? And its creator is more concerned of its own survival. And its true creator is the bankers, not the government. So you can take that as an option. You can look at this forgotten option. It's a private agreement. It's nothing new. We have actually met people still alive today who can remember that they used to walk in a job and the guy says, here, you got this option or this option. This is nothing new. He says you take this option, you know, there'll be deductions and stuff, but you'll get a benefit. You'll get a CPP thing. You take this option, you don't get deductions, but you got to keep everything you got. Okay, so they promoted the benefit rather than the flip side of the income tax on it. If you want, you can exercise it. Earn a living to sustain your life. Exercise your liberty and present yourself as a natural person. Exchange your physical and intellectual property for compensation. You're giving something up. It's some form of energy. You choose the benefits you are willing to pay the price for. We're talking about one out of many that are out there, and they're all separate connector points. Okay, so you need to study them all to see which ones you want. Don't remain disadvantaged and let others choose for you. The reason I put this in quotes is because that's the word they use in relation to people who fall into these default benefit programs. You go to section 15.2, 15.1 and 15.2 of the Charter. 15.1 is very clear. All individuals are equal before and under the law. 15.2 says 15.1 does not preclude, which means forget about 15.1 when you're talking about benefit programs. You know, programs that are for the amelioration of the individual. Okay? So basically, they say if you're into these benefit programs, you fall into them because you don't know what your human rights are. They view that as being disadvantaged. Because I really think that is one of the biggest disadvantages if we don't know who we are. But when you learn who you are, you maybe want to become personally responsible and learn to exercise your rights. They are your rights. And if you don't exercise them, believe me, they will. They love doing that. And when you get to that point, you'll understand that you do not cause harm or imminent threat of harm to anyone or anything. Freedom comes with that balance. And never again let the deception of man destroy your gift of freedom. Learn to live with the respect for moral and spiritual values and the rule of law, all in balance with the Canadian Bill of Rights, so you can become healthy, wealthy, and wise. That's how we were created. If it wasn't for the... Notice, take a look at their game. If we're created to be healthy, wealthy, and wise, what have they been trying to do to us? Make us sick, poor, and ignorant. They know exactly what they're doing. It really boils down to that. So here's what these costs of benefits are. I mean, again, a benefit's a benefit, but you need to weigh it into balance. Okay, here's just a quick look at just some of the highlights of this. Here's a typical employer-employee relationship at $12.50 an hour. Technically, it's $500 a week, $24,000 a year. But when you take all these benefit programs out, that basically 22.8%, which drops that $500 to about $386, so that $12.50 down to $965. $24,000 drops down to about $18.5. Now look at what that costs that employer though. That $12.50 is $500 a week, but now look at all the other, he has to pay the other side of the benefits plus some other stuff. Okay, it's costing him, jumps it up to about $600 a month, or paying out $15 an hour. That's why they keep employees and employers fighting amongst each other. What if these guys ever sat down at a table and started looking at the numbers? Okay, so that $24,000 jumps up to almost $29,000. When you take what this person loses and what that person has to pay above, forgetting any late penalty filings or anything like that, you have a combined loss of about 42.7%. Do you think if both these people sat down, got themselves educated, they could work out a better deal and still get even some benefits within that? This illusion that they created on this one person takes $5-something an hour, about $10,000 a year. And that's one employee. And that's just a constant drain. Okay, and this is at a $12.50. Let's go to a higher, not the highest tax bracket, but just a little bit higher. Second highest, I believe it is, at $33.50 an hour. Well, that's $64,320 a year. Now that's pretty good. When you start walking, $60,000 a year. We'll look what that boils down to when you take off all these benefit programs and stuff. That $33.50 drops to $24 an hour, or $46.5 a year. And this is very high. I kept them really conservative because, I believe that's high 30s, even low 40s on that. But look at what the employer costs. That $64,000 by the time the smoke and mirrors, assuming there's no penalties or interest charged on any of that stuff, jumps up to about $74,000. So you got about $45,000 up to $74,000. Almost $30,000 a year for one employee. You really think if they both got educated, it's worth the time to get educated to see how to work out a better deal, a private agreement between the two parties, instead of having all these government default benefit programs plugged in? So that's the cost of what this stuff does. So here's like a quick summary overview of this common option. Okay? It's for the disadvantaged. It's a nice system from that perspective. Do you realize we can be born in this country, grow up, not learn a thing about ourselves, a thing about the law, a thing about our rights, and we have all these nice little benefit programs lined up for us? I could stand up here and tell you what's so great about this country. You know, we don't even have to think anymore. They'll take care of us. But it's not free. So the default contract of service, the relationship is a government employee and servant. ID requires a social insurance number. The payment is taxable remuneration. Here's what they're doing for you. They're mandatory benefits. To me, that's an oxymoron. It's like, hello. You have to get Canada Pension Plan. That's how it's all connected through that. As an officer, you have to get employment insurance as an insured person. Now, here's the example we're saying. Both of these use a social insurance number, but the legal entity is a different person. And we'll show you why in a second. And if you've really gone into here and didn't know, you most likely get drawn into this workers' compensation as a worker. Okay, but don't worry, you're protected, technically. Now here's the summary of the forgotten option for the person responsible. This is exercising your right with some knowledge and some education. Use a private contract for hire. Basically, in Paradigm, we use the phrase contract for hire for we can communicate as basically a tax-free employment contract. The relationship, you're a private contractor. The ID required, you need a name. You can change it every paycheck if you want. The payment is compensation. See, you've actually expended energy. See, these guys, notice he stood here all night and he didn't do nothing? He's going to leave here with the same amount of energy as he came. But I'm going to have to stop for a coffee. Right? You expend energy. Now, in this, you're not disconnected from the world of benefits. There's tons out there. Okay, but they're all voluntary. Now you can pick and choose. Okay, there's tons of private pension plans. But think about what would your life be. Would you really need CPP if you were to keep all the income tax you ever paid? Think about how your life would be if you could get that one thing out. Okay? But there are tons out there. And because of our some international requirements and our connection, we already have some ones. We have the OAS, which you get whether you ever work for the officer or not. You got the GIS if you ever work for the government officer or not. Right? Why do we need 3 government pension plans? Well, we have 2 because they're they're international requirements, but the one is this nice little one they brought in there for their internal federal government officer. Okay? Employment insurance, you can still get it as an insured person. Since we've started doing this, I don't know of any person who's actually wanted to get it because they realize the illusion behind employment insurance. It sounds good, but by the time you jump through all the hoops, a lot of people say, just give me my money, I'll put some money away for the rainy day. Workers' compensation, you can still get it. Okay, an independent operator, you can still get it. See, they have to make these available to everybody also, so they always had to have a back door for us to get in. Now, if you like the idea of getting hurt, waiting 3 years of appeal, and possibly getting some compensation, go ahead and sign up. But there's tons of private accident insurance that are just a much better deal. Okay, so again, that's sort of a summary of all this stuff. So as we wrap this down, just to sort of finish this off with a little bit about Paradigm and what it is, where we came from and stuff. And really, Paradigm Education is an association of individuals working together all across Canada now. Okay, years ago it started with just a couple people, a couple more. But it's amazing how many people are willing to do what's necessary to save a great country that we have. Now we've come together to combine our passion and our commitment to share this knowledge with respect for moral and spiritual values and the rule of law. To find that balance point. You know, instead of getting rid of this country and saying it's all bad, look at it for what it is, because it is a great country. We just have to get back to that point of getting rid of those who are taking it over. So we can all learn to free ourselves and this country from the greed of the illusion, so we can leave an inheritance for our children and our children's children. And this is the sad reality of it, because as far as this game has gone now, if we don't start doing something, there is going to be nothing for our kids, because our kids will wake up thinking they are slaves, which is nothing new in history, because there's times in our history where people were born thinking they were slaves. You know, as the more and more control they get, the harder it's going to be until we start waking up. Like inside Paradigm, we're extremely confident. What we're seeing here in the intro is just a tip of the iceberg. Even the other course doesn't have the time to go deep. So our confidence is extremely high, but it's a quiet confidence. Okay, and we've been offering this 20-ounce gold reward, and it's yet to be challenged or claimed. We used to have 5, and we upped it to 20. So we put it up to 20, not because we think we're misguided. Okay, we almost did it to help other people. Okay, because when you meet somebody and you start talking about this and they go, oh, it's a scam, or it's this, or it's that, or it's this, right? You say, fine, great. If you're so smart, let's share the 20 ounces. See, we gave it to help you empower, because there are people out there who think, oh, they know everything. Yeah, I guarantee they've never the act. Well, you'll really find, if you start throwing this in their face, you'll find the big difference, you'll find the reality that talk is very cheap. Because anybody can say anything, okay? But when you say, okay, we'll put our money where our mouth is, you put yours. all of a sudden they, go in the back. And again, we made it off not because we think we're misguided, but because our search for the truth is such that we don't mind what the truth is. We just want it. See, when you're looking for the truth, you don't care what it is. And so we never really started this search with a predetermined conclusion, trying to look for something. We wanted to see what it was regardless. Because in simple terms, the truth can only be one of two things. Either we are slaves living in an illusion of freedom, or we are free living in an illusion of slavery. And I think even by the little bit you've seen in this course, you realize that we are free, and this whole slavery thing is just a big illusion that they created. And again, we've been searching almost a year and a half ago. Wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, Chrétien at the time, just asking for the truth. I wrote him, "Dear sir," I said bonjour, because he's French, right? Says, "My name is Russell Anthony Porisky, and I'm writing this letter to you in my capacity as a natural person. I'm the founder of Paradigm Education Group, which is a group of natural persons that have chosen to spend their time and energy studying and educating our fellow Canadians about their human rights. Collectively, we must have close to 200 years, that's probably quadrupled by now, okay, of combined research of the subject matter, and have come to what seem to be some fundamental conclusions. The two main being that human rights are sacrosanct in this country. They're above all, okay? And no act of law can be so written to infringe, abrogate, or abridge any of our natural rights without specifically declaring it in prescribed form." This is Section 2 of the Canadian Bill of Rights. Okay, so this is what has driven me to write this letter to you. Until now, we've attempted to write letters to different ministers for clarification of a few fundamental points in relation to human rights. But as of yet, we have failed to receive a direct response. We seem to always receive these vague and ambiguous responses. They just start spin doctoring it. Okay? It has been these types of responses that has created a lot of frustration for those of us who spend the time to write to further our understanding. So in light of our previous attempts, I thought I would write to you directly in hopes that as the leader of this country, you can make the appropriate directive to the appropriate minister to assure us a clear and direct answer to one of our most fundamental questions. I wasn't going to overload them, I just wanted one. Okay? The one question I would like a direct answer to is as follows. Is a natural person, as defined by Canadian Law Dictionary, working in his own capacity under a private contract for his own benefit, subject to the Income Tax Act of Canada? All that we learned tonight can be compressed into this one question. Okay? The main reason I seek a direct answer to this question is the fact that through our studies we've come to what seems to be the only logical conclusion possible, and that is no. So in an attempt to maintain Paradigm's intent and integrity as human rights educators, we feel we have a duty to ourselves, our fellow Canadians, and this country to verify our conclusions with all levels of government so we can educate others with facts and truth and not misguide or harm them in any way, like you do. Oh, no, I took that out. Okay? You want to see the answer to that? Would that be nice if they answered that? Because see, that's the part of us how we've been trained. We've been trained to look outside ourselves for an answer. We want our government to tell us. Well, I'll show you what the answer to that one was. Uh-oh, it broke. Over a year later, nothing yet. It's almost approaching 2 years. I knew I wasn't going to get an answer, but I almost wanted an answer. But I realized it was the best thing they could do is never to answer that question, because then that would force every individual to find that answer themselves. Okay? Because you're not really free if you have to look outside yourself and ask somebody if you're free. Because if you have to ask them, guess what? They can tell you the next day that you're not. But when you know you're free, why you're free, then you're free for the rest of your life. So you can either wait for someone to tell you that you're free, or you can accept the fact that true freedom comes from within. It comes from knowing the truth. So what is this truth? How do we know of any of this? How do we know of what the truth is? Who really knows for sure? I mean, it's a big illusion from all levels, but we each need to find our own. But consider this, where the logic of the mind, where all the facts and stuff come together, they meet the wisdom of the heart, the truth shall be found. See, because that's that frustration you felt. We've all been feeling. What we see and what we're told does not fit with how we feel. But when those 2 points come together, I don't know if that's the truth, but it's the closest thing that I can relate to. So it's a journey you can either make alone. Just with some of the educational stuff, we try to put as much in there, but you can take the journey alone. Or you can walk with others who are making this paradigm shift. Okay, it's a changing our whole understanding. And a paradigm shift, it's easy as 1, 2, 3. Step 1, learn the path. Spend the time and become educated. What you saw here tonight was the tip of an iceberg. I highly recommend you just don't try to restructure and do this just on what you saw here tonight. You learned just enough here tonight to hurt yourself extremely bad. It's a very deep game they got going. Okay? We got a whole bunch of stuff focused on this. There's our education program. We've got videos and book courses. Like we've got the 12 or 13-hour one that we just retaped. The website just got updated. It has an introductory, intermediate, and advanced level, and it's continually growing. This is a deep rabbit hole. You can join a Paradigm Home Study Group. There's educators all across this country now. And if you graduated there, you can drop in these Paradigm coffee groups. So you can take, like, our education really just focuses around freeing people from their employment and tax. But this, your rights and freedoms expand to all areas of your life, like your privacy rights and banking rights and all that. And so that's what helps sometimes these coffee groups. It gives you the opportunity to take this information into other areas. So again, learn the path. Step 2 is switching paths. If this is the first you start looking at this, you may look at the past and look at the path you were on and go, I need to change paths. Like, we've met some people who've already been restructured. They just had to change their mind. That was easy. But we've met some people that are so commingled into the past, it takes a lot of work to get them out. And here's the reality of it is, this information you learn here is not a silver bullet. It cannot undo what you did to yourself in the past. But there's different ways of dealing with that, okay? You can turn around, take control of the past, get yourself educated, and it'll put your past into perspective. And the future will take care of the past eventually, okay? But if you don't turn around and take control, it won't help dissolve that fear. And it's funny, the fear is so entrenched. There's a couple stories I like relating this. Met a lot of people who haven't filed for years. And really a lot of the reason they file is after they miss 1 or 2, then they get, oh man, I'm 3 or 4. And now they're so afraid to file because they just don't know what to do. One lady we met, she hadn't filed for 22 years. She was already retired a couple years, but she was just so scared, So I don't know how she got connected with us or whatever, and I said, well, before you get all scared, I said, how were you working? Well, I was working at this place. And I said, well, they give you a T4? Oh, yeah. Every year? Oh, yeah. And she had one of these long jobs. And I said, well, they're never going to phone you. She goes, well, what do you mean? I said, well, we got together. She brought 1 year. And imagine, 22 years of not filing. She brought 1 year in. We sat it down. I said, this is why they'll never phone you. Okay, we've rounded out. In 1996, I think she had a tax credit of a tax refund of $341 or something like that. They always take off more than they really need so that they can make a big deal out of tax refunds. It's all part of the game. So that really empowered her. I mean, she's just really released a lot of fear within her. She's actually motivated now to go and try to get all her T4s, get all her, and file back as far as she can. I said, you realize what you got there? You already have your retirement fund. Imagine 22 years plus interest. They'll never phone you. You better start phoning them. Okay? And you can correct errors made from assumptions. It's amazing. A lot of these joinders are assumptive joinders. And sometimes, not all of them, but some of them you can just go in there and correct it. One of the educators, like we had this one guy over in the island, he's just getting educated and stuff, and in the process he had some communication to CCRA, so there's some quasi-joinders there. So they demanded him to file, and he fulfilled the demand, but he was about 3 days late. So technically he failed to comply to a demand letter in time, 3 days late. So they knew that he was getting educated, so they went after him, and not only to try to take him to court for the 1 year for failing to comply, because he was 3 days late, and they even told him, he says, well, we normally don't mind if you're 3 or 4 days late or whatever, but we want to go to court, use it as a fishing trip. And it was just like, they're so blatant about it. And then what they did was added 3 years of GST charges onto it too. And so because he was working with an educator and just a bunch of series of letter writing, because knowing how the game is played, before it even got to court, we got a nice letter back, or the educator got a nice letter back from the Crown going, well, we're not going to proceed with charge 3, 4, and 5. Or 2, 3, and 4, which was all the GST. They dropped the GST charge because they knew they didn't have any grounds on it. And the first charge, the guy said, hey, I'm already guilty on it. Here's the, why waste time in court? So it's the power of the knowledge, by being able to understand the game, go in there and face them for what it is. The truth will, I believe, will always prevail. Because in that whole process, there's this idea they learn the importance of filing honestly. Okay? People say, well, how do I file? And well, you file honestly. Because we all have different lives, and some of you have pension plans that are connected to the officer, some of you don't. Some of you maybe work in two or three jobs, and a couple of them you do as a natural person, a couple of them you do as an officer. So there's no distinctive file 0 or file this. It's file honestly, because when you learn to file the truth, see, we've been taught to cheat the tax man on purpose. Because when you cheat the tax man, guess what? You live in guilt and fear the rest of your life. But when you cross that line and you learn to file honestly, the fear is gone. The large course goes through the games they played even after court, and it shows you how by finding the truth and sticking to the truth, the game is over. Okay, step 3, walking the path. There's a lot of people, see, we never even had step 3 for about the first year. We were just throwing videos out to having people get educated. We realized, and a lot of people started realizing, there is a little bit of a difference between learning the path, learning this, and actually applying it into your life. And so what that really created was the need to create some additional education for educators to study so they could actually go in and sit down in a business and help a business restructure, help the employees restructure, make sure the education got into there and that people truly understood and be there. You know, it's a really short-term period compared to CCRA's life plan, right? So through that process, you're not forced to learn everything right now. I mean, what you're looking here is a 10-year learning curve, which we compress in a very comfortable, I think it's a 2-year program there. Okay, so you can restructure your business and occupation right in the, instead of waiting until you go 2 years down the road to figure it all out and make all the details. And the whole goal is to get you at the end of that is so that you can make all future decisions based on facts. You know how to look when someone asks you to do something, you're back empowered in your life. That's our whole goal, is because to empower a bunch of individuals, okay, so that we all can stand together. And if by going through this, it doesn't happen overnight because you didn't get wrapped in. Before you know it, shift happens. One day you wake up and you go, what's that feeling? And we've seen it, and it's really neat to see. He goes, what's that feeling? And it's a feeling of freedom. It's something we probably really never relate to. But it's like, wow, you're back in control of your life. You know what obligations you've imposed on yourself. You know that if somebody comes out, tries to blindside you, you're empowered enough to say, well, show me where I have to do that. Show me your authority. I'll do whatever you want. It puts a very calming peace back within your life. And it will happen. It just takes time. So to close this off, I want to sort of look at this quote from Arthur Schopenhauer. He goes, all truth passes through 3 stages. So we'll know eventually, because we've watched these stages, as this truth here starts coming into society, because it will go through these stages, and it's starting to do that. First, it is ridiculed. And depends where you are and the people that are around you. Again, I guarantee you walk up to someone tomorrow and says, you realize you don't really have to do this if you don't want CPP? They'll laugh at you. Okay, fine. You know, you got to expect that. Okay, there's a lot of, because, and this is no different than humanity is very much like this. How many people, when we thought the earth was flat, the first guy that stood up and said, no, I think it's round, you think they laughed at him? They actually hung him. Okay? Second, it will be violently opposed. See, this information actually scares a lot of people because they don't understand it deep enough to realize their life is not going to be destroyed. And I'm not talking about the average person. I'm talking about those who have a vested interest into this illusion. Okay? Accountants sometimes are very afraid up front until they slow down and see it for what it is. Right? We had like... it's a very scary thing. We had this financial planner. He knows a lot of accountants, and what he did was he went to one of them. Actually, he got educated, and he was fairly well educated too, because he was strong enough to stand on his own. And he went to the accountant and said, "Hey, have you heard this natural person paradigm stuff? You know, about taxes?" And he goes, "Oh, it's a scam." And so he was strong enough to say, "Well, why do you say that? Put your, you know, speak. Give me some facts behind that, right?" And the accountant goes, "Well, because I haven't heard of it." So you got to really watch. Is again, I've yet honestly to see. Well, really, we haven't. We have not ever had an accountant or lawyer who sat to this stuff and ever come to the end. That is why accountants all across this country are shifting, because we understand when we all understand we've all been scammed by the same guys. We need to start working together. We've got tons of CCRA people who thought this was thing. We have a lot of good developing relationships inside. They're not our enemies. See, we've been taught to fight amongst each other, but when we realize who taught us to fight amongst ourselves, it's that we'll start working together to clean this thing up. And third, eventually, and it's happening, it's going to be accepted as self-evident. You know, all those people who violently oppose it, yeah, I know this, yeah. You know, here we have these options. See, ultimately, we never have to destroy the Income Tax Act. It doesn't have to be repealed or anything. It can sit there. Hopefully, it'll get dusty in the archive somewhere. But it still is a part of an option. So it doesn't have to destroy it. But there will be that day it'll be accepted as self-evident. So to know this truth, we simply have to open our hearts and free our minds. So that's tonight, and I thank you for attending.